Chapter 494. For people who were about to meet death, any salvation from others was a life-saving straw. It was an existence that they should cherish and be grateful for. In theory, this argument was correct, but in reality, for some people, there were some ways of salvation that they could not accept. In Xiaoluo's eyes, Luo Ye's plan didn't benefit the young man at all. Instead, he had to sacrifice his health and even risk death. This was unacceptable to Xiaoluo, who valued the person she loved more than herself. The Fallen, this was the gathering of evil cultists that Luo Ye had been fighting against for a while. They had been enemies with the chosen king family since 1,000 years ago, and their methods were unpredictable. They had created countless vicious cases in history. Being targeted by such a mysterious organization and falling into a weakened state was undoubtedly the biggest flaw. From the current information, the mother goddess of the 6 disasters and the savior are enemies. They can't fight together. This is a matter of faith, so it's difficult for the Fallen to know that I'm in a weakened state. On the other hand, Dean Antonio and the Vatican are searching for them on a large scale, so the Fallen won't have time to be distracted. That's true, but so what? My goal is to face all difficulties with you. Whether it's the curse of the 6 disasters or the attack of the Fallen, it's all the same. Living alone isn't happiness. My happiness is the happiness of 2 people together. Most importantly, I don't want our child to be motherless. 1 second, remember. That's right, we're blessed by Pei-Tila, who's in charge of reproduction. Although we only did it once, but maybe we're already pregnant. Hearing Luo Ye's words, Xiaoluo's emerald eyes suddenly widened, and her breathing became slightly hurried. She lowered her head and touched her belly, and for a moment, her expression was conflicted. Now that she had experienced all kinds of hardships, the first half of her wish had been fulfilled, and after this night, there seemed to be hope for the second half to be fulfilled. When she thought that she might already have a little life in her belly, Xiaoluo couldn't control her emotions and couldn't say the words to give up her life. Dear Xiaoluo, do you know the vows that people make when they get married? Yeah, I know that too. I remember there's a line in it. Even sickness and death cannot separate us. Xiaoluo's body trembled slightly when she heard the young man's words. She raised her head and whispered in disbelief, well, in fact, I asked Pei-Tila to make the ring not just as a curse vessel. Although I can't hold the ceremony because of your body, at least tonight when we become husband and wife, I want to put this ring that symbolizes love on your hand. Not only for your body, but also for our feelings. Miss Xiaoluo Sorofia, are you willing to accept this ring and marry me? The young man's question echoed in the room, causing Xiaoluo's eyes to widen and his body to tremble with excitement. Such a reason is too cunning. Isn't it impossible to refuse? Under Luo Ye's nervous gaze, Xiaoluo raised her hand gently after a long silence. She smiled with tears in her eyes and said, the slightly choked words echoed in the room. The black-haired young man smiled with relief when he heard the words. He stretched out his hand and carefully held the girl's palm. He gently put the crystal-clear ring on the girl's finger. After that, the girl took the ring and put it on Luo Ye's finger. The silence lasted for a while, but the atmosphere between the two became more and more heated. Whether it was Xiaoluo or Luo Ye, they both understood that the strong feelings could no longer be expressed in words, so there was only one way to express it. Yesterday evening, when the reddish-haired girl ordered all the servants to leave, Gulacy knew what his miss was thinking. This night may have been a sleepless night for Luo Ye and the others, but in fact, Gulacy didn't sleep much. Rather, he was worried about the maid urinating. But after morning came, there was no movement in the gem necklace as time passed. Looking at the rising sun, the other servants were worried, but Gulacy was excited. Thinking of this, Gulacy excitedly clenched his fists. He knew that his miss was most likely going to succeed. In the carriage, the young man hugged the exhausted girl who had fallen into a deep sleep. He looked at her adorable sleeping face and thought about everything that had happened. Xiaoluo was very concerned about children. This was something that Luo Ye had discovered long ago. Although Shi Ye's humans lived in an unstable environment, Xiaoluo's desire to have children was stronger than others. Gently exhaling, the black-haired young man looked at the ring on the girl's hand. An indescribable warmth emerged in his heart. But it had to be said that although the ring had been worn, the blessing of the Earth Mother had not yet taken effect. After all, the girl's health had just improved, and the burden of pregnancy was still too heavy. The young man and girl's long night finally came to an end. The exhausted two only woke up in the afternoon. But unlike usual, when they woke up, their room was in a mess. Go take a bath first. There are many marks on your body. The two of them entered the bathroom together. However, what was different this time was that the young man and the young woman did not separate. Instead, they soaked in the pool together. Seeing Gulacy and the others tidying up the bed, the reddish-brown miss was extremely shy. She buried her face in Luo Ya's chest like a coward. Seeing this, Luo Ya had no choice but to take the girl to fill her stomach and recover her strength. She had yet to recover from the pain of the first time, and because of the extreme passion, she had to start the second time. After working so hard, it was only natural that the girl could not withstand it. Even if she had the constitution of an extraordinary, it would be difficult for her to move around today. Before this trip, Luo Ya had been chased out of the bedroom by Xiaoluo. Because of a series of affairs, the young man had almost forgotten about this matter. But he did not expect to get the answer last night. It seemed that because Luo Ya was usually too calm, Xiaoluo was worried about her own charm. In order to increase the success rate, she prepared these things, but she did not expect that the final result would almost cause Luo Ya to lose control. After trying to control his thoughts, Luo Ya and Xiaoluo began their usual lovey-dovey time at the dining table. But unlike usual, the two were sweeter today. Even the experienced and knowledgeable maids of the Sorofia family had never seen such a sparkling and translucent ring that seemed to emit a faint radiance at all times. As for Grace, who was a high-ranked extraordinary, she had a deeper understanding of it. Not only did her relationship with the young man go smoothly, this love even received the blessings of the gods. Such a good match was rare in the world. However, what the maid did not know was that, in fact, this level of blessings was not enough to satisfy Paitila. The golden-haired Earth Mother had already reached the point of longing for children. Xiaoluo, I'm afraid we can't go back to Rose for the time being. Hearing the words of the black-haired young man, the brown-haired young lady nodded slightly and immediately understood the young man's meaning. Since they wanted to lure the snake out of its hole, then Xiaoluo and Luo Ya naturally could not return to Rose. After all, for the 6 disasters that had not yet formed, Rose was a big country that could not be destroyed. It would not appear there in any case. Similarly, other big cities must be ruled out. My dear, what you mean is, looking at the brown-haired young lady, Luo Ya said with a helpless smile, but his words were exceptionally serious. Feeling Luo Ya's silent trust, Xiaoluo slightly clenched her hands. Dear, if I make a mistake. Family? I understand, dear. Leave this matter to me. After taking 2 deep breaths, Xiaoluo smiled and took over this heavy responsibility. As the young lady used her bloodline ability to astrology and divination, the gem necklace team set off again and drove to the distant destination. After this period of observation, Luo Ya could basically confirm that the 6 disasters already knew about their situation. It was obvious that Luo Ya's behavior and unique aura made the disaster. Monster feel that something was wrong and took action to use the curse to kill the 2 of them together. But as the young man expected, the 6 disasters' curse was completely ineffective against him who had 2 crown stones. At this point, the attack and defense had reversed. Luo Ya and Xiaoluo had become the waiting party, while the 6 disasters had to hide for a long time. This situation was obviously not what the other party wanted to see. If this situation continued, the disaster monster would definitely take action. Chapter 496. More than half a month after the start of the journey, Luo Ya and Xiaoluo's relationship further warmed up, but correspondingly, the state of the 2 people was getting worse and worse. For this situation, the maids who found that the 2 people's bodies were getting worse day by day were naturally worried, but for the boys and girls who were already prepared, this was equivalent to good news to a certain extent. Xiaoluo was lying on the boy's chest at this time, listening to the boy's heartbeat with a worried face, and Luo Ya was stroking the girl's back as if he was comforting Xiaoluo's emotions. Both of them knew that the expected day was coming. It's getting closer and closer to us. Well, it should be about time. Seeing the girl's reaction, Luoya couldn't help but stop. The boy lowered his eyes and looked at Xia Luo's emerald eyes. He was about to ask something, but he didn't expect the girl to speak first. Afraid? It's too smooth. Indeed. Although the smooth development of things was a good thing for the boy, and the information collected so far didn't have any negative news, it had to be said that sometimes too smooth was a strange thing. When in the eastern region, Luo Ya's understanding of power was still immature. Before the incident at Tucker Fortress, he was only 4 source level, not even a high-level extraordinary. But in the face of such Luo Ya, Hidden Fog hesitated for a long time, and finally gave up its original plan to devour everything around it. It could be seen that even when the boy was weak, 6 disasters generally didn't dare to challenge Luo Ya, but this time, the other party seemed to be too bold. Was it because the temptation of being able to solve the problem of the Highland Elf bloodline and the crown, source substance holder in one fell swoop? Or was this 6 disasters different from the past and had other means? In fact, I'm just guessing without any basis. Don't think too much. If your mood is bad, it will also affect your body. The black-haired youth said as he looked at Xia Luo. The reddish-brown-haired girl hesitated for a moment before gently nodding her head. Seeing this, Luo Yu was even more certain. Should we stop for now and report this to the higher-ups of the Alliance? Dean Antonio and the others will definitely help. After thinking for a while and realizing that this proposal was not feasible, Xia Luo's face showed a worried expression. Luo Ya, on the other hand, had a calm expression as he gently hugged the girl to comfort her. As the guardian of the goddess of fate, Xia Luo often said that everything was destined. If one had to define their current situation, Luo Ya also felt that it was destined. It's fine. Actually, I've already made some preparations. Besides, I can't stop now even if you want me to. Chapter 499. Frozen Earth Creator. This was a monster that left a terrifying mark in Shiya's history. When the giant's body was engulfed, the warriors in the distance couldn't help but stop their actions. They widened their eyes, not understanding why Luo Ya targeted his own tamed demon. In the sky, the monster of disaster let out a strange cry. Its eyes stared at Luo Ya as if it was restless. In the sky, the black mass of curses continued to surge and expand. The eyes of the huge figure flickered. Below, the black-haired young man faintly curled up the corners of his mouth. His eyes were filled with determination and murderous intent. No matter how powerful the Lord of Death Tide's curse was, it couldn't stop the other 6 disasters' ability. Just like what Luo Ya did, he used the twilight wind to seal off the sky, making it impossible for him to escape. After that, he used the Frozen Earth Creator as his weapon. In the middle of the freezing air, the black-haired young man reached out his hand. The crystal-like power of the crown condensed into a solid form. It drifted between heaven and earth with the howling night wind, penetrating into the deepest layer of the freezing air. Along with the influx of the crown fragments, the explosive power of the curse began to increase rapidly under the cover of the fog, using blood as the price to further increase the power of the curse. This was a method that Shiya's cursementers often used. However, to Luo Ya, this was a crazy move. Life towards death, sensed the young man's condition and started to explode. The young man's body was surrounded by an extremely dense curse power, and it immediately caused the Lord of the Dead Tide in the sky to be wary. After a short moment of restlessness, the Lord of Death Tide suddenly roared as if it sensed something. Its fierce scream was like the wail of the dead, causing fear to emerge from the hearts of all the creatures in the dark sky. In the next moment, a huge black mass of curses swooped down toward the black-haired young man. In this critical moment, the black-haired young man didn't do anything. Instead, he closed his eyes. On his body, a crimson radiance began to emerge together with the gushing cold air, intertwining and fusing with each other. Under the young man's smile, the fog gradually dispersed, revealing the figure of the Gulen Daer. However, this time, the tall giant had changed his appearance. Floating ice crystals revolved around his body, and the majestic frozen earth energy became his armor. On top of the Gulen Dayer's head, the crimson crown emanated a magnificent radiance, bringing irresistible power. Although the crown stone and the king's selection blood were both Luo Ya's abilities, they had always been two different powers, or perhaps they belonged to two different systems. But in fact, it wasn't that these two different systems didn't have any intersection at all. And the intersection between them was Luo Ya himself. The crown shard was the glory of the past brought by the crown, source substance. It was also the ability to crown the kings of the races who dominated the world in the past. When Luo Ya returned the crown, his curse power would strengthen Gulen Dayer and the others through the power of the crown, source substance. This time, the young man used his own blood. Under the shroud of the cold air, the Lord of Death Tide's untouchable defense was nullified and the Gulen Dayer had no more scruples. Witnessing this unbelievable scene, the monster in the sky roared angrily. The strong sense of danger made the blurry figure of the curse even more distorted. However, as if it didn't want to believe this fact, after a short period of madness, the black rain once again rose into the sky and turned into the ultimate disaster. It suddenly fell towards the Gulen Dayer who rushed out of the fog. But this time, the result was completely different from before. The silvery white cold air rushed into the sky, and wherever it passed, the restless curse power would freeze and shatter. The Lord of Death Tide's gigantic body that covered the sky was like a black jelly. The giant's fist penetrated through its body, and the monster screamed in agony. Countless black curse power disintegrated like flesh and blood, and it gradually dissipated in the white fog. Before the broken body could recover, the black mass that covered the sky suddenly began to roll and shrink. In an instant, the vast night sky reappeared, and on the other side, the black disaster had turned into a meteor and crashed down. In the sky, the black mass formed by the curse power fell like a meteor and returned the sky to the stars. However, whether it was Luo Ya or Gelt and the others who were fighting in the distance, all of the extraordinary individuals present knew that it wasn't a desperate escape. It was a desperate gamble. Chapter 500. When the flickering light collided with the endless darkness, the violent repulsion of the curse caused the entire area to collapse. Luo Ya and the Lord of the Dead Tide's body also rapidly crumbled. Life towards death was indeed a skill that could reverse the situation and turn defeat into victory. But just like anomalies and vessels, the excessive power had begun to harm Luo Ya, and the young man knew that this was unavoidable. The black, turbid current was unleashed under the rapidly depleting curse. In order to survive, the Lord of the Dead Tide had overdrawn its potential as one of the 6 calamities. The black-haired young man also poured his life into this attack. The giant's fist was like an unsinkable warship, riding the wind and breaking the waves of the Black Sea. Whether it was the starry night sky or the vast land, whether it was the ice that was harder than steel or the curse that almost no weapon could harm, everything was incomparably fragile at this moment. In the fierce clash, Luo Ya's consciousness gradually blurred, but his tenacious willpower allowed him to stand on the border of life and death and not take a step forward. Protecting the glory of mankind, leaving his name in history, and possible rewards appeared one after another. But in the face of these, Luo Ya didn't show too much reluctance until the figure of the red-haired girl appeared in front of him. Being attacked by this terrifying calamity was fate for Xia Luo. It was a fact that had been decided since the moment she was born and bore the bloodline of the Highland Elves. From this perspective, Luo Ya was actually the outsider who suddenly intruded into the battle. In fact, the Lord of the Dead Tide was indeed afraid of the crown and didn't act rashly, but so what? If death was the girl's fate, then Luo Ya was the one who changed this fate. And now, he wanted to use his actions to prove that whether it was the terrifying calamity of extinction or the predestined fate, nothing could take the girl away from him. The source of the 6 calamities could be found to be the Mother Goddess, an existence that surpassed the gods in ancient times. It seemed to have inherited the Mother Goddess's level, and the power of the 6 calamities was also strange and unpredictable. Even the gods were not immune to it, let alone ordinary saints. Under the protection of countless enchantments, the warriors of family Seraphia raised their heavy shields that were shining with the luster of gems and surrounded the carriage. They firmly blocked the drifting black curses and frost outside of the shields. Meanwhile, the warriors of the country of knights had already retreated to defend. Everyone was nervously staring at the intense conflict between black and white in the distance. Once the black-haired youth was defeated, the terrifying calamity would definitely extend its claws to the others. Even if it was on its last breath, as one of the 6 calamities, the Lord of the Dead Tide, whose power level was far higher than normal extraordinary individuals, it could still kill everyone present. Boom! The tall Gelt temporarily transformed into a giant. He held a heavy shield at the forefront, and a layer of ice hung on his body. Selena and the others surrounded the carriage and released their spells, stabbing their weapons into the ground to stabilize their bodies. The sound of the explosion shook everyone's eardrums. The intense light illuminated the sky and the earth. Under the strong light, everything in the vicinity seemed to be buried in a white light. It was not until a few seconds later that the light slowly faded. After a brief moment of silence, the warriors crawled up from the ground and regrouped. The Cursemancers quickly repaired the enchantments that were almost completely destroyed. However, after that attack, no explosion, light, or shockwave appeared again. Before the battle began, Luoya had instructed them to never get close to the battle site. If the final result was not satisfactory, they were to immediately leave with Xia Luot and seal her in the crystal made by the gem spell. They were to wait for the final hope. That area has been covered by the power of the 6 calamities. Even I can't see it. The black-haired maid looked at the dim distance with a conflicted heart. However, inside the gem necklace, the originally pale brown-haired girl on the bed who looked like she could die at any time was quickly recovering. The sleeping spell was unknowingly broken by this torrent. The brown-haired girl's eyelids gently moved for a moment before she finally slowly opened her eyes. We won. At the last moment of the battle, the Lord of the Dead Tide, who had fallen into madness, released an attack that exceeded Luoya's expectations. Even so, it still couldn't defeat Luoya and the Goulandair, who displayed their full potential. That was an attack, but it wasn't an attack. To a certain extent, it was similar to a concept. For a long time, the black-haired young man had doubts in his heart. He didn't know why the Goulandair didn't use weapons. After all, in terms of body structure, humans and giants were actually quite similar. In fact, in various myths and legends, giants often fought with weapons. Right in front of Luoya's eyes, the fist that almost crushed space hit the Lord of the Dead Tide. This calamity that had been rampant since ancient times was completely shattered into pieces. Then, the cold air that covered the sky swept across and all the curses turned into ice fragments. The moment the black curses completely dissipated, Luoya's tense nerves finally relaxed. The death of the Lord of the Dead Tide not only eliminated a huge threat to the human world, but also completely cut off the curse of 2 generations of the Seraphia family. It also had a major impact on the human world as a whole. Xia Luot Seraphia's fate had completely changed. The bloodline of the Highland Elves was preserved. After the monster that constantly devoured the girl's life was eliminated, the Rose commercial union and the Seraphia family would enter a stable state. With this as the cornerstone, the logistics base of the human alliance would no longer be a problem. The soldiers on the battlefield would also be able to obtain supplies faster. Looking at the slowly dissipating black curses, the young man felt a sense of security and accomplishment that he had never felt before. However, what Luoya didn't expect was that danger suddenly appeared at the last moment. It was a kind of fear that was similar to standing outside the door and being watched by someone through the peephole. It was a feeling that only appeared when one was in an absolute danger zone and was at an absolute disadvantage. Mother Goddess. This time, it was in the real world. In this situation, being watched by Mother Goddess in the real world, there could only be one reason, and that was that Luoya killed the 6 disasters. Then, as a form of revenge, would Mother Goddess take advantage of the fact that he was extremely weak and could even be said to be on the verge of death? Luoya, who had no other choice, could only stand still and let the time pass by. After an unknown amount of time, that creepy gaze suddenly disappeared, and the next moment, the long-awaited system prompt sounded. Crusade successful, detected crown stone mutated body, initiating primary evaluation. There is a certain risk in absorbing, system activating auxiliary system. Yes/no. Since the system allowed him to absorb the crown stone, at least it meant that the surrounding environment had stabilized. In other words, Mother Goddess should have disappeared. The system prompt was still ringing, but unfortunately, at this time, Luo Yi didn't even have the strength to answer. After going through a bloody battle in an extremely weak state and being watched by Mother Goddess, the young man's body was like a lamp that had run out of oil. At this time, the black-haired young man's surroundings were deathly silent. Only the cursed remains of the Lord of the Dead Tide's death shrouded the surroundings like a dark cloud. The thick, black cloud circled around him, but it also sealed all his hopes. When a person dies, they will leave behind a corpse, and after the Lord of the Dead Tide died, it left behind an aimless curse. The density of the curse wasn't something that an outsider could approach. And now that he couldn't even stand, Luo Yi couldn't walk out of this area alone. Dear. After the sudden warm light, a familiar sobbing voice sounded. The next moment, a red-haired girl suddenly appeared and hugged the boy tightly in her arms. Chapter 501. When the reddish-brown-haired girl opened her eyes from her deep sleep, the stars were already flickering in the sky. Looking at the stars that had escaped from the terrifying calamity, Charlot's consciousness wasn't clear yet, and her emerald eyes were filled with confusion. Time slowly passed. Not long after, the girl woke up and her eyes gradually glowed. Then, her body trembled slightly. She widened her eyes as if she had understood something. Her emerald eyes were filled with surprise. Everything was telling her that the long suffering had ended. Of course, she immediately recalled the young man who promised to give her a new life before she fell into a deep slumber. She muttered the young man's name and struggled to get up. Her movement immediately attracted the attention of the maids. The maids excitedly supported the girl out of the carriage. Gulacy cried tears of joy when he saw Xia Luot. The guards of the Sorofia family couldn't help but cheer. However, the red-haired girl didn't feel much joy. Xia Luot's emerald eyes scanned the surroundings, searching for Luo Yi's figure. After asking Gulacy, the girl shifted her gaze to the distant darkness. Then, she looked at the churning black clouds and felt that something was wrong. The moment she felt this strange yet familiar curse, Xia Luot widened her eyes and instantly understood the situation. Then, she made a prompt decision and brought Gulacy and the others to the final battlefield. Remember, Xia Luot and the others wanted to find Luo Yi, but they were forced to stop. When the cursed black clouds blocked their path, even Gelt and the others who had foreign bloodline showed a fearful expression. Even if the Lord of the Dead Tide's body had perished, it wasn't a place where humans could set foot on. Although Xia Luot could transfer her vitality to the black-haired young man due to the effect of the symbiosis ring, this didn't guarantee Luo Yi's survival. Severe external injuries would cause a large amount of vitality to leak out in a short period of time. This wasn't something that the ring's ability could catch up with. Once it crossed the line of life and death, the young man's ending would still be death. The curses in the air became thicker and thicker, causing the young lady who had just recovered from her illness to turn pale once again. However, Charlotte didn't care about this at all. After breaking through the black clouds formed by layers of curses, the young lady finally found that familiar figure. Dear. Luo Yi's face was extremely pale. It was almost transparent and didn't look like a living being at all. Looking at the young man, Xia Luot's tears couldn't stop flowing. At this time, the young man's curse power was completely exhausted. His vitality was almost completely maintained by the ring. Even the fluctuation of his curse power had disappeared. However, this wasn't the most important thing. The most important thing was Luo Yi's physical condition. After defeating the Lord of the Dead Tide, Luo Yi's curse power was completely exhausted. Without the curse power, the young man couldn't stop the bleeding and the passage to the ancient gods was closed. In fact, when Xia Luot checked, the young man's blood had less than a third left. When she realized this fact, the red-haired girl almost broke down. Even if it was a high-level extraordinary, losing half of their blood would be life-threatening. Now that Luoya only had a third of his blood left, it was almost certain that he would die. Originally, Xia Luo wanted to bring the young man out for treatment. However, after checking Luoya's condition, this idea was immediately dismissed. Because Luoya could die from a bump, and there wasn't enough time. Biting her lips, the red-haired girl thought hard. After a while, she seemed to have thought of something. She stretched out her hand and cut open her wrist. The black-haired young man was in danger. In the end, the root cause was excessive blood loss. In this case, the effect of a direct blood transfusion was far better than some curses. Moreover, there was no need to worry about the problem of blood type. The rejection of the blood was what Xia Luo was most worried about. Once it happened, not only Luoya, but even Xia Luo would be implicated. There was even a risk that the young man's king's blood would reverse the process and destroy his blood. Originally, this was something the girl absolutely couldn't do. However, in order to save Luoya's life, Xia Luo resolutely chose to try. Chapter 502. In the past, Luoya had experienced several life-and-death battles, but it had to be said that even those unimaginable life-and-death battles, spanning hundreds of years, had never let the young man truly experience the taste of death. If it weren't for the ring of symbiosis that kept him alive, Luoya could be considered to have perished together with that terrifying disaster. And because of that, it was extremely difficult for the young man to wake up this time. After a long period of effort, Luoya finally recovered a little. The sounds in his ears gradually became clearer, and as his hearing recovered, many voices began to intermittently enter Luoya's ears. Move faster. Save your life first. First, it was the voice of the Sorofia family's medical team that he had heard before. Noisy reports and orders were in a mess, and the sound of spells being activated was incessant. And after that, it was a close distance, choked with sobs, but it seemed to be exceptionally weak. Such a large amount of blood loss was extremely dangerous even for an extraordinary. It could even lead to brain death and becoming a vegetable. In order to prevent this from happening, Xia Luo desperately tried to wake the young man up. And after Luoya opened his eyes, he didn't see anything. To be precise, the young man's vision was pitch black. And as if sensing the abnormality in the young man's eyes, the reddish-brown girl asked in a trembling voice, "Ischemic blindness." This was a symptom that had a certain probability of occurring after a large amount of blood loss. It was almost incurable for ordinary people, but it could be recovered for extraordinary people whose bodies surpassed that of humans. In fact, this situation often occurred when soldiers on the front lines escaped from close combat. If in the past, Luoya sacrificed himself to save Xia Luo, then this time, the young man really sacrificed himself for her. This sacrifice had far exceeded the level of lovers, and even the relationship between an engaged couple couldn't be compared to it. And because of this deep relationship, the young girl's heart ached. The sobbing young girl opened her mouth to apologize, but halfway through, she saw the young man shake his head slightly as if he didn't want to hear the apology from Xia Luo. Looking at Luoya's reaction, the reddish-brown girl was slightly taken aback. Then, she immediately understood what Luoya meant. Thinking of this, the young girl wiped away her tears and endured the heartache to change the topic. Looking at Luoya, who couldn't see her, the reddish-brown girl choked with sobs and held the young man's hand tightly. "I'm by your side, always, always by your side, and I'll never leave." So, sob. "Miss, I understand your feelings, but the spell is about to start." Listening to Gulacy's report, the reddish-brown girl quickly glanced at the nearby conjurers who were ready, then got up and kissed the young man's face. After saying this, Xia Luo reluctantly left the bedside. The next moment, the room was filled with light. Countless gems emitted a variety of colors and gathered toward the young man on the bed. At the same time, Luoya felt a warm current flowing into his body and drowning him. This question didn't affect the young man too much. After all, in the past 2 months, Luoya didn't have the opportunity to see their abilities. Chapter 503. Luoya had to admit that thinking was a heavy burden when one's body wasn't in good condition, especially for the current Luoya. After losing a lot of blood, the young man could barely eat. This was for the sake of his body's safety, but it also limited his energy. But even so, Luoya managed to analyze some things in this short period of time. Although according to the current literature, this group of people obviously didn't intend to act together, it was unknown whether they could sense each other. Whether they could communicate with each other was also unknown. Thus, to prepare for the worst, it was necessary to treat them as potential threats. Needless to say, Frozen Earth Creator was still suppressed by Isha Bela Sophia's gem curse and was in a deep sleep in the sea. According to various clues, Mr. Darkness should have been completely wiped out by Luo Ya's ancestor, Vincent 700 years ago. It wouldn't be able to climb back up for a while. In the historical fragment from 400 years ago, Luo Ya obtained the Wind Summoner SE egg because he changed the situation of the Saint Heroes Assembly in Leinster City. But in normal history, without Luo Ya's help, the Saint Heroes Assembly of that year was defeated and fled. The higher-ups of the Saint Heroes Assembly who safeguarded the E-egg were also nowhere to be found. And finally, after some analysis, Luoya felt that the most troublesome one was the fog of concealment that swallowed Tucker Fortress not long ago. Although the 6 disasters were silent monsters that came and went without a trace, they were still limited by the attribute of movement speed. From the map, it could be seen that the eastern region where Tucker Fortress was located was very far away from the human world, which was the eastern basin of the Luo Su Basin. There shouldn't be any major danger in a short period of time. After making such a judgment, the black-haired young man's body began to feel tired again. His slightly dizzy brain made Luoya retract his consciousness, and his eyelids became heavier. Unlike the first time she woke up, this time, there were no members of the medical team or maids coming in and out of the room. The whole room seemed a lot more spacious, but unlike the room, Luoya's bed was not spacious. The appearance of Xiaoluo Tsurofia didn't surprise the black-haired youngster, but what surprised Luoya was that the girl's body was wrapped in bandages just like Luoya's. There were also many curses on her body. Although Luoya didn't seem to have many wounds on his body, his vitality hadn't improved much after experiencing so many injuries. He was still on the verge of death. Therefore, he had been receiving energy from Xiaoluo. After a rough estimation, Luoya was basically certain that he wouldn't be in any danger at this stage if he didn't borrow the girl's life force. At most, he would become weaker. Thinking of this, after seeing Xiaoluo's situation, the boy naturally wanted to take off his ring to make his lover feel better. "Dear, what are you going to do?" A familiar voice suddenly sounded in his ears. The black-haired young man's body unconsciously stiffened. He turned his head slightly stiffly, and what entered Luoya's eyes was Xiaoluo's somewhat serious face. Seeing this girl, Luoya immediately understood what the previous curse was about. Luoya naturally didn't expect this, but facing Xiaoluo who discovered it, the black-haired young man still chose to stick to his idea after thinking for a while. "Liar, you can't even stand up right now, right? I don't think this is called fine." Chapter 504. Although the Sorofia family has now become one of the most famous families in Shia, in fact, they don't know much about themselves. Relying on the bloodline intuition of the Highland Elves, the Sorofia family achieved great success in business and was now the richest family in Shia. However, after this trip, the Sorofia family only knew that their ancestors were Highland Elves. But even so, they still didn't know the position of the Highland Elves in Shia, such as their relationship with the 6 calamities. Yes, this is the duty of the Highland Elves in ancient times, and the reason why the gem curse can suppress the 6 calamities. Well, the curse of the Lord of the Dead Tide might not be an accident. In the worst case, not only the Lord of the Dead Tide, but the other 6 calamities might also attack you in the future. On the bed, the black-haired young man told Charlotte the information he had just learned and the analysis he had derived from it. After hearing it, the brown-haired girl was shocked and her expression turned serious. Her eyes flashed, and it was obvious that she had thought of many things that she didn't understand in the past. Now that she heard Luoya's explanation and knew that the Highland Elves' bloodline could suppress the 6 calamities, everything seemed reasonable. However, the girl was also a little confused. Although this was an important matter, it didn't seem necessary to mention it when they were talking about the next generation, right? You can say that. Although only one bloodline can be awakened, whether it's the Highland Elves bloodline or the King's chosen bloodline, the suppression effect on the 6 calamities is very obvious, and the combination of the two may produce some unprecedented changes. Even if the Highland Elves bloodline didn't awaken, it still had certain effects as a foreign bloodline. One of them was its affinity with the gem curse. In other words, if the child of Luoya and Xiaoluot awakened the King's chosen bloodline, then there might be a person with the crown, source substance, and the ability to use the high-grade gem curse. It was obvious that the calamities absolutely couldn't tolerate this situation. Although the intelligence of the 6 calamities shouldn't be able to distinguish the difference between humans and the Akate family and the Sorophia family, they could still sense this sense of crisis. Darling, you're saying? The other possibility was that the 6 calamities didn't only want to take back the egg. They also wanted to kill Ishabela and the others to prevent Ishabela with the Highland Elves bloodline from coming into contact with Vincent of the Akate family and giving birth to an existence that could threaten all calamities. For this conjecture, Roja felt that the evidence wasn't enough, so he didn't say anything. But the girl who guessed something clenched her hands and was obviously uneasy. Seeing this, the black-haired boy thought for a moment and tried to persuade her. But isn't it too much of a coincidence that our 2 races would be attacked by those calamities as soon as we have a close relationship? Also, what about the child? Charlotte couldn't hide her worry as she looked at Roja pitifully. The black-haired boy was silent for a while. Of the S's? Of's, S's, SS? Lord, S's. Chapter 505. Whether it was in Luo Ya's previous life or in Xia's life, the side effects of the potion were one of the important criteria to judge the quality of a potion. Looking at the blushing girl in front of him, Luo Ya's brain quickly heated up. He didn't expect the Buelo Strong Resuscitation Potion Type 4 to have such an effect. However, after thinking about it carefully, he was somewhat relieved. Then, which function had deteriorated the most? When a person was sick, their energy would be weak, and they wouldn't have those messy thoughts. This could be said to be basic knowledge. In Xiaoluot's case, she had been in a state of near death for a long time. In order to conserve energy, her body would naturally shut down some functions that wouldn't pose a threat to her life. The reproductive function was the most obvious one. In fact, after that night with Luoya, the 2 of them hadn't done it again. It wasn't that there was a problem with their relationship, but it was that their bodies didn't allow it. They simply didn't have that kind of impulse. Now, with a bottle of potion, along with the recovery of the body, it was normal for the instinctive part of life to become active again. Dear, it's so hot inside. Looking at the blushing elf girl, Luoya took the initiative to open his mouth and took the task. At the same time, he slightly sighed. Originally, Beyond the Lookout Strong Resuscitation Potion Type 4 was given to Xiaoluot by Luoya. Because the girl trusted Luoya, she didn't test the ingredients in advance. Now that there was a problem with the side effects, Luoya naturally had to solve it. At this moment, the black-haired young man finally understood what a complete set was and what a chain of consumption was. Under Xiaoluot's shy gaze, Luoya simply took out a heart-shaped small bottle, unscrewed the cap, and drank half of it in one breath. The taste in the mouth was incomparable to the Buelo Strong Resuscitation Potion. Because it contained the blood of a unicorn, the taste inevitably carried a faint, bloody smell. However, it had to be said that the effect was immediate. Dear, what did you drink just now? The black-haired young man replied with a smile as he looked at the innocent young lady who didn't know much about potions. Upon hearing this, Xiaoluot blinked and became even more puzzled. Exactly what it means, but it's the antidote for your side effects. Just like that, their beautiful night officially began with the help of the medicine. It was no secret that Xiaoluot wanted to have a child. The biggest reason was naturally because she loved Luoya deeply. In addition, it was also because of Kadia's approval. She wanted to have a family and many other factors. However, it had to be said that this matter was not easy. Is there no result this time either? Looking at the girl holding the monitoring curse vessel on the sofa and responding faintly, Luoya fell into silence for a while. Unlike the first time before, After drinking the resuscitation potion, the girl's physical functions recovered. In a short period of time, the operation state was even more intense than usual. The vitality in her body was also far higher than the first time. In theory, the possibility of gaining something in her stomach had greatly increased. For this point, Luoya could only say that the reality could not be changed based on the love between the two. Xiaoluo's physique was probably more difficult to deal with than expected. Her wish might not be realized in a short time. Dear, I'm sorry, but you have worked so hard. If it were an ordinary person, I'm afraid you would have succeeded long ago. This is indeed. It's okay. Recently, because the curse power in my body hasn't recovered, the channel between me and the ancient gods has been closed. After a while, I will find Paitila to find a way. Well, that's a very powerful blessing. You are not the only one who is anxious about the child. She is also very anxious. After the initial rescue operation, the bodies of the two were out of danger, and they officially entered the second stage. Experts and scholars from all over Xia began to treat the two in order to recover as soon as possible. For this situation, the consultant on the medical team euphemistically reminded the black-haired boy to restrain himself and focus on physical recuperation for the time being. Luoya was very cooperative. After all, the one who wanted to recover the most was Luoya himself, and the reason was very simple. That was the black cloud that was still outside the window. Crown Stone. This was the ability Luoya obtained by absorbing the power of 6 disasters. However, because he was in a bad state when he defeated Lord of the Dead Tide, the boy hadn't absorbed it yet. For Luoya, this was simply a plate of delicious food in front of him. He couldn't eat it. Luoya wanted to absorb the crown stone as soon as possible and avoid direct conflict with these possible enemies. After making this request, the medical team of the Sorofia family changed the previous slow recuperation plan and changed it to a short-term plan to recover a certain amount of strength as soon as possible. With this as the goal, the medical team formed by the Sorofia family began to treat the boy for a short period of time. After receiving full support, Luoya's operation finally began. Strictly speaking, the absorption of the crown stone didn't require Luoya's effort because the system could do it. But even so, the black-haired boy still chose to adhere to the principle of being cautious. Dear, do you really have to go? Even if the monster is dead, the curse is still there. Will it affect your body? Although Xiaoluo didn't fight against Lord of the Dead Tide, and didn't even see Luoya's battle, the bloodline of the Highland Elf allowed her to intuitively sense the power of this terrifying disaster. The aura of the curse floating in the air was particularly familiar to the young lady. Looking at the young lady who was hesitating as if she wanted to hold onto his lover, the black-haired boy didn't immediately answer the young lady's question. After pondering for a moment, he turned around and cupped Xiaoluo's cheeks with both hands. Then, how about we go together? You don't need to be alone to absorb the crown stone. Besides, you've been in there before, right? The bloodline of the Highland Elf should be resistant to these monsters. Hearing Luoya's sudden invitation, Xiaoluo couldn't help but look hesitantly at the dark curses under the night sky. It was rare that she didn't immediately answer the young man's question. Seeing the fear in the young lady's heart, Luoya couldn't bear it for a moment, but he didn't say anything to stop her. Recently, when he lived with Xiaoluo, Luoya noticed that the young lady had some different behaviors from usual. For example, she didn't like to open the window and deliberately didn't look outside. Once Luoya led the young lady to the window, Xiaoluo would lean in the young man's arms and intentionally or unintentionally avoid the corpse of Lord of the Dead Tide. Now that Mother Goddess had begun to awaken frequently, the 6 disasters were also activated. As the heir of the Highland Elf bloodline, Xiaoluo was likely to encounter these monsters in the coming days, and Luoya might not be able to be by the young lady's side every time. As the saying goes, the way to overcome fear is to face it head-on. Luoya wasn't a psychotherapist, but he was able to accompany Xiaoluo. This time, the young lady accompanied Luoya as a protector, and the situation was similar to the last time when she broke in to save Luoya. Will we be in there for a long time? Time passed by little. The two stood facing each other under the moonlight, and the surroundings were silent. The maids waiting in the distance looked at each other worriedly. They didn't understand why the young man and young lady were so quiet. Luo Yu's will was gradually consumed as time passed, and his thoughts gradually wavered. Looking at the stiff elf lady in front of him, the black-haired young man couldn't help but soften his heart. However, before Luo Yu said anything, Xiaoluo suddenly took 2 deep breaths, raised her eyes, and gave a firm answer. Hey, you agree? Stroking the ring on her hand, the young lady's eyes gradually became firm. When she raised her head again, looking at the slightly surprised young man in front of her, a smile appeared on the elf lady's face. Xiaoluo, the young lady said as she activated the curse vessel with her. The next moment, the golden soul expanded rapidly and rushed into the black curse. Surpassing oneself, this word had always been regarded as a difficult challenge, but it was also a sign of progress. Because it was based on the comparison of oneself and had nothing to do with outsiders, the difficulty of surpassing oneself was quite high, especially when it was related to some emotions. That was the love for the young man. Although she was very nervous at first, as time went by, the Highland Elf bloodline in Xiaoluo's body felt the breath of 6 disasters, and the spontaneous counterattack behavior had become more and more obvious. After observing along the way, Luo Yu, who understood that the young lady had no problem, smiled. Soon after, he stopped at a place with the densest curse and nodded slightly to Xiaoluo. After a certain distance, the young man looked at his system and found a familiar prompt. System determination, absorbable, estimated cost of 100,000 gold coins. Do you want to absorb? Looking at the problem that appeared a few days ago, the black-haired young man couldn't help but raise his eyebrows. He didn't expect the price to be so cheap this time. Before, whether it was Frozen Earthmaker or Wind Summoner, they were all absorbed by Luo Yu when they were still alive. They had a certain level of self-consciousness, so naturally, they would resist. But this time, Lord of Dead Tide was completely destroyed by Luo Yu. It was equivalent to collecting a corpse, so the price was reasonable. Ding! Collecting mutant, the golden soul that sensed the power of 6 disasters, shined brightly and firmly protected Xiaoluo. On Luo Yu's side, the surging darkness gathered around him and gradually swallowed him. For Luo Yu, this was a familiar feeling from the previous 2 absorption, so the young man was very calm. However, what he didn't expect was that after the system began to operate, something that he had never seen before suddenly appeared in his mind. Chapter 506. In the past, Luo Yu never thought that there would be any unexpected gains from absorbing the 6 calamities. After all, for the black-haired young man, absorbing the 6 calamities consumed a lot of energy even with the help of the system. After these 2 experiences, Luo Yu's expectations for absorbing the crown stone were extremely low. Although this time, it was similar to collecting a corpse, but for Luo Yu, it was basically a request. Such a low request could be said to be quite easy to satisfy. In fact, the first half of the absorption was indeed peaceful. However, what Luo Yu didn't expect was that when the absorption entered the latter half, some memory fragments that obviously didn't belong to Luo Yu poured into the young man's mind. Dear, what's wrong? The black-haired young man resisted the urge to comfort the worried Xiaoluo. Then, he shifted his attention to the numerous information in his mind and quickly identified the origin of these chaotic memories. 6 calamities. They were terrifying monsters that had wreaked havoc in the long river of history and destroyed countless civilizations. Countless intelligent beings had tried their best to investigate, but to no avail. According to legends, the origin of these monsters was an existence that surpassed the gods, Mother Goddess. 1 second memory, as the saying goes, know yourself and know your enemy, and you won't be defeated in 100 battles. For the black-haired boy, the memories of the Lord of the Dead Tide might contain the weaknesses of the 6 disasters, and in order to find out the truth, Roha plunged into the memories of the Lord of the Dead Tide. Luo Yu had the experience of checking the memories of others in the past. However, unlike the soul fragments of his ancestors, the memories of the Lord of the Dead Tide weren't as rich as he expected. Instead, it was much more boring. Judging from the behavior pattern of the Lord of the Dead Tide, in these memories, it didn't have any predatory behavior. The specific way of growth was unknown. Luoya pondered for a long time and speculated that it probably grew by absorbing magic elements in the air. This was also the current mainstream view in the academic world. Of course, since the memory wasn't complete, theoretically, there was a possibility of missing the predation scene, but the possibility was very small. On the other hand, Lord of the Dead Tide had a habit that caught Luoya's attention. Luoya had a lot of guesses as he watched Silver Moon through the Lord of Dead Tide's perspective. Such a thought appeared in Luoya's mind and quickly expanded. But after thinking for a while, the black-haired youth let out a sigh. Luoya, who was helpless against these conditions, sighed and continued to watch. As the young man continued to read, the images in his memory began to change dramatically. What was going on? 6 disasters are still in confinement. But unlike the starry sky when he first came in, it was now dawn. Dear, is it over? Really, shouldn't you be thanking me at this time? Hearing Charlot's exasperated ridicule, the black-haired youth rubbed his brows, revealing an expression of dizziness after overusing his brain. He then spoke again. Oh, just thanking me? I think a man should be more practical. Wait, dear. What's wrong? Xiaoluo, didn't you want me to do something? I'm not used to dragging things out for too long, the elf lady said as she grabbed the young man's clothes tightly. Her face blushed and her ears trembled slightly. Her shy and cute appearance made Luoya's heart beat faster. The young man turned his head away embarrassedly. After thinking for a moment, he kissed the girl's cheek and put her down. The elf lady landed on the ground and let out a sigh of relief. Then, she glanced at Luoya and complained softly. I'm sorry. My emotions aren't too stable because I saw something earlier. Looking at the young man, Xiaoluo blinked and naturally recalled Luoya's serious expression last night. After hearing Xiaoluo's question, the black-haired young man nodded after hesitating for a moment. Luoya sighed and said these words. Xiaoluo hesitated for a moment and didn't immediately ask. Instead, she suggested to go back and rest. Luoya revealed a smile and held Xiaoluo's hand as they walked out of the cursed area. The two figures gradually left this land of death and headed toward the convoy under the escort of the maids. Reign of the Death Curse, side effect, reduced vitality. After absorbing the 6 calamities, the crown stone was born. Although it was a powerful skill, it didn't have any surprising elements. The only thing that could be said was that the side effect might be fancy, such as the erosion time breath. In fact, in terms of attack power, Luoya felt that the Lord of the Dead Tide wasn't particularly powerful. After all, compared to the frozen earth energy, the activation of the death curse had a process. Powerful, extraordinary individuals might be able to hold on for a long time, and at most use it to exhaust their vitality. But in terms of consumption, which skill could be compared to the erosion time breath that could blow away time? It was undoubtedly a good thing that he obtained a decent skill. However, due to the memory fragments of the Lord of the Dead Tide, Luoya's mood couldn't be that relaxed. Looking at the young man, the brown-haired girl revealed a worried expression. Looking at the young man who obviously had something on his mind, Xiaoluo couldn't help but ask. Luoya revealed a conflicted expression, and after a moment, he sighed and organized his thoughts. Origin? You mean the ruins that father went to? It's simple. Because it was locked up by someone. Luoya said, and began to talk about everything that he saw. As the young man narrated, Xiaoluo couldn't help but widen her eyes slowly. Fortunately, although the memory fragments were blurry, in addition to the images, there was a voice that Luoya could understand, which was the human language. As Luoya watched, he was surprised to discover the reason why the Lord of the Dead Tide appeared in the ruins and the initiator of everything. Collector, Cardos Arde. Luoya only knew about this ancestor, and he had never seen his face before. The reason why Luoya could confirm that the person who appeared in the memory of the Lord of the Dead Tide was Cardos Arde wasn't only because of the ability that he displayed, but also because of the image in the memory fragment. To Luoya, this woman who visited was too familiar. She was the ancestor that he had always respected, Estrid Arde. After seeing this scene, A passage that Estrid said in the historical fragment immediately appeared in the young man's mind. Thinking of this, Luoya confirmed the identity of Cardos, and his mood became excited. And the reason was simple. In order to obtain the knowledge of the Twilight Sage Association from 1,000 years ago, Luoya concentrated on collecting information, hoping to gain something to change the current situation. However, he didn't expect that Cardos would come to a conclusion that he almost couldn't accept. That is, the Mother Goddess is absolutely not to be trifled with. Chapter 507. As the saying goes, everything has a root. There is always a reason for something to happen, and the same goes for the birth of a conclusion. Luoya didn't know the specific situation of the Lord of the Dead Tide at that time, but it should be similar to the Wind Summoner's egg that he obtained before. Its power was sealed in the gem, and separated by a layer of seal, there was naturally little information about the outside world that could be obtained. Everyone was carrying a head on their shoulders, and anyone with a little brain wouldn't want to be enemies with this existence beyond the gods. But the problem was that it was almost impossible for Luoya. The conflict between the two sides couldn't be reconciled, just like so many disappeared civilizations in the past. And Luoya himself was the focus of the Mother Goddess, and it was likely that he was already on the must-kill list. To be honest, Luoya was a little puzzled by the Collector, Caldo's words, because Caldo's situation was too similar to his. He should have fought with those monsters a lot. In fact, there was 6 disasters, sealed in a crystal on his table. Luoya intuitively felt that the answer to this question might subvert his understanding, but unfortunately, things didn't develop as smoothly as people imagined. Caldos didn't mention anything in this regard, or rather, there was no memory of Lord of the Dead Tide. Looking at Xia Luot, who frowned after hearing these words, the black-haired young man held the warm teacup in his hand, and after a moment of silence, he said, "Maybe it's true, then what about the second one? This, dear, didn't you say that the conflict between us and the Mother Goddess is inevitable? And those monsters are likely to take the initiative to attack us. This is no longer our problem, right?" "You mean," after a short moment of thought, the black-haired young man said this with a serious face, and Xia Luot was silent. The blood feud of the Second Era had never happened before in the history of the Royal Selector clan. At the end of the Second Era, 1,000 years ago, the tragedy of the Ald clan could be said to have been caused by the believers of the Savior. Their influence had lasted until now, and even now, this group of hidden cultists was still eyeing the Royal Selector clan covetously. Thousands of years had passed, and the once prosperous family had disappeared. Only the old and the young were left in the Akkad family. The heroes of the past were buried in history, and the wise men who were dedicated to saving the world under the name of Dusk had also disappeared. From the information Roja collected so far, the awakening of the Savior is inseparable from the relationship between the hybrids and the awakening of the Savior. And every time the hybrids invade, it will be a disaster that will destroy the human race. The enmity between the Mother Goddess and the Savior is no longer a secret. There are related records in the records of various races, and the Ald clan in the Second Era probably knew more about them. The black-haired young man analyzed and thought that this was the most likely and most convincing reason other than the helpless explanation of not being able to defeat the mutants. On the other hand, the red-haired girl didn't agree with the view of Luo Ya's ancestor. Xia Luot Sorofia, as the successor of Luo Ya and the next leader of the Sorofia family, was naturally full of vigilance and hostility toward the Savior who could cause the mutants' catastrophe. But before this, Xia Luot was still a young girl, and after falling in love with Luo Ya, there was a high possibility that she would have the fruit of their love in the future. Judging from the current situation, the Mother Goddess might be less harmful than the Savior, but as long as the 6 calamities had the possibility of extending their evil hands to their child, then to Xia Luot, the Mother Goddess would be an enemy that must be completely eliminated as soon as possible. Looking back at Xia Luot, who was staring at the young man's cheeks and subconsciously caressing her lower abdomen, Luoya couldn't help but feel a little guilty. He hurriedly curled up the corner of his mouth and nodded, expressing his agreement to Xia Luot's words. Seeing the black-haired young man's expression, the red-haired girl widened her eyes slightly and asked, "I didn't say from the beginning that we should act according to this plan. Plans need to be adjusted according to the actual situation, and it's not like the older the better. Ancestor Cardos is indeed very powerful to be able to seal an existence like the Lord of the Dead Tide, but this doesn't mean that his plan is perfect. Not to mention anything else. Now that the royal family has undergone tremendous changes, the huge family of the past no longer exists, and I'm the only awakened one left. In the situation where the disparity is too great, the threat of the Mother Goddess and the Savior is almost the same, and I can't tolerate you being targeted by those monsters. From the moment those monsters targeted you, we are bound to be in a hostile relationship, not to mention there's the problem of the child. That's a good answer. As a father, you're qualified. Of course, even if you're my dear, I will be angry if you don't consider the child. No, I'm not. Feeling each other's body temperature and heartbeat for a long time, the two finally separated slowly. The black-haired young man recalled the conversation between the two and couldn't help but feel a little curious. After hesitating for a moment, Luoya looked at the red-haired girl and asked, "If that's the case, I will definitely ignore you for the next few days until my dear changes her mind." Bed. There's no need to separate the bed. It's been so long. Although I will be angry, I won't break the agreement and, my dear, your body is not stable now, and if there's any relapse, it will be troublesome. Looking at the girl who blushed and found all kinds of excuses, Luoya's eyes widened slightly. For a moment, he felt a little touched, and after putting down his worries, the tiredness of browsing, Lord of the Dead Tide, for a night finally hit at this moment. Well, it's a little. Seeing Luoya rubbing his eyes, Xiaoluo said so, and her face showed a little sleepiness. Seeing this, the young man held Xiaoluo's hand and returned to the bedroom, hugging each other on the bed. Due to the Lord of the Dead Tide's corpse, the concentration of the curse was unprecedentedly high, and it was seeping in all directions. The experts and scholars of Rosset were very worried, and they had organized several cleanup operations, but the results were not good. Shia didn't have a Natural Environment Protection Association, and the people of Rosetta weren't environmental pioneers. The reason why these experts were so anxious was that although in theory, this place didn't belong to any country, in fact, there was a river that connected to the eastern region of the Rosetta Commercial United Nations. With such a large poison bomb placed next to the pillow, the Sorofia family naturally couldn't sit still. Fortunately, everything was resolved when Luoya absorbed the crown stone. However, what puzzled the experts and scholars was that after Luoya used some unknown method to greatly reduce the curse, the order to evacuate was suddenly issued. One of the reasons for this was that the land contaminated by a Lord of the Dead Tide had turned into a land of death, and it was useless to clean it up. The other reason was for safety. In addition to the possible threat of the 6 disasters, this place was also the place where the Saint Heroes Assembly appeared and fought with the elites of the Sorofia family. Although these evil cultists disappeared after Lord of the Dead Tide was eliminated, it was obviously not a wise move to stay here. Rabbits would bite people if they were cornered, and no one knew what evil cultists would do if they were cornered. Luoya didn't have the leisure to fight with them, so it was better to leave as soon as possible. The warriors of the Country of Knights left early, and naturally, there were no troublesome farewells when they set off. After a long journey, the Gemstone Necklace team finally embarked on the return journey. The medical team also continued to treat Luoya and Xiaoluo. Luoya was naturally happy about this, but the reddish-brown girl was happier than Luoya because as Luoya's curse power recovered, the passage to the ancient god would be reconnected again. The Mother Earth that Luoya had always called their hope could finally officially come online. In the bedroom at night, a black-haired young man sat on a chair by the window and looked up at the night sky. In the young man's arms, a blushing Miss Elf was sleeping soundly on Luoya's chest. The bed behind them was a mess. In the past few days, Luoya and the reddish-brown girl's lovey-dovey frequency was very high, and the reason was very simple. It was because they had embarked on the return journey. If we go back, there will be elders in the room. It's too embarrassing to stay in the same room. Luoya expressed his understanding of Xiaoluo's situation. Just like a rebound, the two's entanglement became more frequent and intense. In the process, Luo Ya's physical condition wasn't as good as before. Fortunately, with the help of Cupid's kiss, he successfully maintained the absolute advantage. Caressing the reddish-brown hair of Miss Elf in his arms, the young man revealed a gentle smile on his face. In his mind, he was thinking about the recent conversation with Xiaoluo. In the fragmented memory of Lord of the Dead Tide, Estrella wasn't the only visitor. Before Estrella's memory, many people had visited Caldos. Many of them were members of the Twilight Sage Association who were obviously of foreign bloodlines. And the one who left the deepest impression on this disaster monster was one of them. After listening carefully, Luoya was sure that the two were talking about the savior according to the sporadic words in the conversation. Luoya was naturally interested in this part of the conversation, but to be honest, this topic wasn't rare at that time. However, Luoya didn't expect to hear a familiar name in the conversation. Goulandair. Chapter 508. In Xia's long history, the giants were actually a relatively mysterious race. Unlike the witches, the reason why the giants were mysterious was not that they were secretive in their actions, nor was it that they were far away from the crowd, but simply that they had disappeared early. Nothing could wear away everything more than time. Even if the giants had a glorious history, even if they were once the overlords of other races, they were still so vulnerable in the face of the long river of time. After thousands of years, there were not many records of the giants left. Even the Arde family, who knew a lot of history, would not know the name of the Goulandair unless they had done a detailed investigation. In fact, the descendants of the giants in the country of knights had a lot of misunderstandings about their ancient ancestor. Someone who could make the 6 disasters, even the sealed monsters, afraid was definitely not a nobody. When such a person mentioned the Goulandair when meeting with Caldos, it was hard to imagine that the two of them were just chatting casually. In fact, there were some words that were hard to ignore in their conversation, such as savior. A long time ago, when Luoya and the Goulandair had just signed the contract, the huge skeleton had told him that Luoya was not the first descendant of the king's blood to see the Goulandair. However, it was just like a gamble. The result of such a summoning was likely to be a difference in the compatibility between the two sides, and their temperaments might not be compatible. The ancient gods might not be willing to follow the summoner, and without the help of the ancient gods, the test of the historical fragment would become extremely dangerous. 1 second, remember, to some extent, Luo Ya's summoning was the safest way to contact the ancient gods. However, this kind of summoning depended on one's luck and potential. After all, there were many strange guys among the ancient gods who did not have strong combat abilities. Luoya was not surprised that the huge skeleton had met the Arde family in the past. If he had known about the existence of the Goulandair in advance, he would have probably taken a gamble. However, it turned out that the ancient gods still liked people who were fated to meet them. As a partner in the contract, the huge skeleton did not seem to like people who had a strong purpose. However, combined with the memory of the Lord of the Dead Tide that Luoya saw this time, the black-haired young man began to have a lot of guesses in his mind. Estrid once said that although the Twilight Sage Society was fragmented at the end of the Second Era, there were still many groups carrying out their respective missions. Among them, there were 2 most important groups. One was the group led by the Collector Caldos against the 6 disasters, and the other was the alliance between Carolyn and the royal family of the ancient Austin Empire. 1,000 years ago, the Arde family was still a big family. Although the conversation between the family members was not arrogant, those with lower status would consciously abide by the etiquette of the nobles, so they would be more polite. This was the result of the difference in status between the two sides. A few years ago, Luoya had received information from the Phantom of Royakat. According to Roy at that time, the last emperor of the ancient Austin Empire, Charles Ackman, had re-established contact with the main Arde family. The purpose was probably to deal with the awakening of the Savior and the attack of his believers. Although the final result was the destruction of the ancient Austin Empire and the beginning of the largest westward migration in history, it had to be mentioned that the Savior had once again entered a deep sleep. It was not until 2 years ago that he showed signs of awakening. Goulandair's memory of his death had always been very vague. When Luoya asked him before, he basically didn't know anything. He was like an elderly patient with a disease. But after the battle with Gelt, who had the blood of the giants a year ago, the king of the giants seemed to have remembered something. But as time went by, the originally peaceful human world began to gradually become chaotic. The believers of the Savior appeared and targeted Luoya. The 6 disasters entered the active state. Mother Goddess also opened her eyes. After so many things happened, it seemed necessary to confirm the situation of Gulendayer. Looking at the stars in the night sky, the black-haired young man muttered to himself. He carried the girl in his arms back to the bedside. After lying on the bed, feeling the gradually re-established channel with the ancient gods, the black-haired young man once again strengthened his faith. It had been a few days since the gemstone necklace left the place where Luoya and the Lord of the Dead Tide fought to the death. During this period of time, the entire team was heavily guarded. The speed of the journey was also much faster than when they came. In a few days, they entered the territory of Russia and began to return along the road. This kind of territory that didn't belong to any country was likely to become a paradise for the cultists due to no one managing it. There may also be some tricks on the road. Similarly, because it didn't belong to any country, no country would be responsible for killing people here. Therefore, it became a paradise for assassins. Many military and political figures in history died in this chaotic area. With the improvement of these external conditions, Luoya and Xiaoluo's safety level naturally increased. After entering the territory of Russia, the cursed circuit in the black-haired young man's body had basically returned to normal, and the channel with the ancient gods could be opened. Of course, meeting with the ancient gods like this had to be done one by one. The young man hesitated for a long time before he felt that the conversation between Luoya and Gulendayer should be between the two of them. This was Luoya's respect for Gulendayer and also his gratitude for fighting side by side with him. But what the black-haired young man didn't expect was that before he thought about how to inform Xiaoluo of this decision, the red-haired girl proposed it herself. "Hey, what you mean is..." The girl smiled and got up, kissed the young man's cheek, and then walked out of the door alone. Luoya couldn't help but sigh at Xiaoluo's meticulous mind. Stroking the ring on his finger, the black-haired young man felt lucky to be favored by such a girl, but then he adjusted his mentality and began to mobilize the cursed power in his body. When the young man opened his eyes again, everything around him had changed. The classic and elegant room had disappeared and was replaced by a bloody plain with no end in sight. Carefully looking at the surrounding environment, the sandstorm was still the same, and the bloody ground was unchanged. Nothing seemed to have changed at all. After some observation, Luoya began to move forward according to the route in his memory. Thinking about this, the black-haired young man kept moving forward, and not long after, a huge figure appeared on the plain. After seeing Luoya, the king of giants completely regained his consciousness, and the light in his eyes quickly became stronger. Seeing Gulendayer moving his huge body, Luoya also showed a smile. "Well, not bad. No, it's you, not me, who can defeat that disaster. All I can do is give it my all. Without your cold air, I can't fight that monster." "Well, if that's the case, it's our victory." Upon hearing the black-haired young man's words, the tall giant couldn't help but nod, apparently agreeing with this statement. Looking at Gulendayer like this, Luoya could clearly feel that he was in a good mood, and the young man also expressed his understanding. Looking at the king of giants who was in a good mood and talked a lot more because of this reason, Luoya couldn't help but have a déjà vu feeling like he was exchanging experiences with friends after playing online games. And after the two of them discussed the previous battle for a long time, the black-haired young man finally got to the point. Looking at the huge skeleton, Luoya described everything he saw before in detail. And after hearing Luoya's description, the Gulendayer fell into deep thought. After thinking for a moment, he nodded slightly. "Did the woman who looked for you say anything at that time?" After a moment of silence, the Gulendayer gave such an answer. It was obvious that before signing the contract with Luoya, the huge skeleton didn't take too many things to heart. Instead, he maintained the role of a dead person and didn't want to interfere too much with the real world. "Gulendayer, can you tell me about your life?" "That's right. Although it's just my guess, you seem to have some relationship with the Savior when you were alive. right? Under Luo Ya's question, the huge skeleton fell into silence. One had to admit that the young man's question was quite straightforward, without any intention of hiding anything. If the two of them were strangers, such a question was likely to anger the other party. But for the two of them who had been together for many years, Luo Ya knew that this was nothing. Gently lowering his huge head, the Goulandaire looked at the young man who calmly looked at him on the ground. He maintained silence for a long time. The light in his eyes flickered as if he was recalling the secret that had long been buried in time. After a long time, the giant finally spoke slowly. Looking at the serious and even a little nervous young man below, the Goulandaire paused for a moment, then calmly said without hiding anything. The giant's words were surprising. It could even be said that it was the most troublesome situation for Luo Ya. But to be honest, Luo Ya had already prepared for a certain extent in his heart. For example, the ancestors of Xia Luot, the Highland Elves, were once followers of the Mother Goddess and even assisted her in managing the 6 disasters. Then, it wasn't strange for the giants to follow the savior at that time. It's just that, some things need to be confirmed with the Goulandaire. Goulandaire, I think you also know that the Akhat tribe has an irreconcilable blood feud with the savior and his believers since 1,000 years ago. In the future, it is inevitable that I will be hostile to them, and a battle will be inevitable. Looking at the huge skeleton, the black-haired young man calmly made a promise, returning the freedom of choice to the Goulandaire himself. However, what Luo Ya didn't expect was that the giant king shook his head after hearing this and immediately denied it. The tall giant said so. His eyes flickered, and he said faintly, "After all, I killed him." Chapter 509. What do you mean by twists and turns? Before coming here, Luo Ya had some mental preparation for the Goulandaire's possible answer. However, it turned out that plans could not keep up with changes. A second ago, Luo Ya was still worried about whether the huge skeleton would join the battle, and the next second, the Goulandaire directly threw out a shocking answer. Looking up at the tall giant under the setting sun, Luo Ya's golden eyes widened. He was surprised by this answer and was speechless for a while. At the same time, many questions emerged in his mind. The strength of the savior was unquestionable, and it might even be unimaginable to others. Although the Goulandaire was powerful, he was still just a god after all. How could such an existence be defeated? And to say that he was killed, this was obviously impossible because even at this moment, the savior was still alive and affecting the world. Looking at the tall giant, Luo Ya's heart was full of doubts, but he did not refute because he understood the Goulandaire's character. He knew that this arrogant warrior was not a person who would boast. If the Goulandaire said that he killed the savior, then he must have really killed the savior. With this question in mind, Luo Ya quietly waited for the king of giants to continue speaking, and it seemed that the huge skeleton also noticed Luo Ya's thoughts. After a moment of pause, he added, "Body?" The huge skeleton said so, with a low and hoarse voice. However, such a content was a shock to Luo Ya. Some of the eager young men asked about everything that happened in the ancient times, but the Goulandaire shook his head in response. The tall giant sighed. He looked around, and then told Luo Ya about the recovered memory. As expected, is it because of the fall of the savior that you became enemies with him? After saying so, the Goulandaire looked at the setting sun in the distance, downplaying his role. After listening to the words of the huge skeleton, Luo Ya finally understood the meaning of this place where the Goulandaire was located. Buried under this land were the skeletons of the giants, and the Goulandaire was the king of giants. In the past, Luo Ya thought that what happened here was a rebellion, and the Goulandaire also died in the rebellion. But now, it seemed that this was not the case. With only the strength of a race, they defeated the unimaginably powerful savior. Even if it was only his body, it was absolutely a miracle. But correspondingly, the giants also paid a huge, unbearable price. Just like the philosophy of the giants, most of the powerful race that once dominated Xia had been buried in this battlefield. Facing an almost undefeatable enemy, the giants launched attacks again and again, and fell one by one under the radiance of the setting sun. In the end, they won, but the race also went into decline. The fallen savior was a huge threat. Other intelligent races, including dragons and angels, couldn't imagine that they would be so short-sighted as to let the giants fight alone. Could it be that there was a reason why they couldn't take action? Dragons and angels? They really can't take action, because they can't get close to the savior's body at all. They will be eroded by the fall and go crazy. In fact, the chain reaction caused by the fall of the savior varies according to different races. For you, the effects of the savior's whispers aren't that obvious. But for some races who have signed a contract with the savior and formed an alliance, the effects are much greater. Chapter 5:10. How different were the humans in Xia and Luo Ya's previous life? Although the people of Xia were affected by the magic element, at most, the color of their hair was a little different. Some of the Transcendents had a more perfect figure and appearance due to physical mutation or special bloodline. Other than that, there was not much difference, especially when they were just born. Both sides were basically the same. No wonder Xia Luo became more and more beautiful, and her temperament became more and more noble as time passed. It was because the bloodline in her body was more and more similar to that of a Highland elf. In Luo Ya's previous life, the process of pregnancy was the combination of sperm and ovum, forming a fertilized egg and developing into an embryo. Although there was magic elements in this world, no matter how hard people trained, they wouldn't be able to reach the ovum, right? From a scientific point of view, although the success rate of this kind of thing was different from 10 consecutive times, the difference wasn't that big. There was no need to do something like 10 consecutive times. Besides, 10 consecutive times, do you think I'm a horse? Indeed, for a normal couple, one time is enough. More than that won't be of much use, but you're different. I asked him to do it more, not because the success rate would increase, but to stimulate my blessings. Hearing Pei Tila's words, the black-haired boy widened his eyes. He didn't understand why blessings were related to this. Seeing Luo Ya's reaction, Pei Tila showed a helpless smile and explained. 10 years? What did 10 years mean? On the other hand, not to mention how difficult it was to endure 10 years, the condition of being together every day was something that Xia Luo couldn't achieve. As for Luo Ya, as the only child of the Akot family, the mother goddess would glance at her from time to time. The long-term target of the Savior's believers, the only designated partner of the Saint Heroes Society, and a big member of the Six Disasters fan club. Her daily life was even more colorful. 40 years, even for an elf lady who had a much longer lifespan than a human, this was too long. 40 years was nothing to Luo Ya, but for an ordinary person, it was equivalent to a young man working until he became an old man without any harvest. Not to mention other things, this was a mental blow to him and Xia Luo. The second method is very simple, and it's also what you need to use. It's a short period of powerful blessings. That's right. It will last for a few minutes, but the corresponding effect will be many times stronger. In the past, it was used for races that had a fast mating speed or races that had a hard time reproducing. A few minutes. Who are you scolding? Luo Ya recalled the approximate time of their last meeting and wanted to speak with a conflicted expression. However, before she could say anything, the reddish-brown-haired girl beside her blushed and opened her mouth. As she spoke, the young lady recalled the numerous times she had fainted. She couldn't help but look at Luo Ya. When their eyes met, the elf lady hurriedly turned her face away and lowered her head shyly. Pei Tila also expressed her understanding. You mean to say... The golden snake turned to look at Luo Ya, whose eyes were wide open, and explained with a smile, "It's possible. I didn't expect it to work like this." The strength of the effect is ordinary. After listening to Mother Earth's explanation with a smile, Luo Ya was dumbfounded. However, he immediately perked up. On the other side, the reddish-brown-haired girl was also a little excited. "That, Lord Pei Tila, may I ask when this blessing will take effect?" Pei Tila said, and gestured to Luo Ya. The black-haired young man closed his eyes and sensed for a moment before confirming Mother Earth's words. However, what Luo Ya didn't expect was that Mother Earth's parenting gift package wasn't finished yet. King's Selection Blood, Highland Elf Bloodline, and Mother Earth's blessings at birth? This treatment was much better than Luo Ya's. Furthermore, the Highland Elf bloodline's gem curse was strictly of the Earth attribute. It was a seamless combination with Paitila. The black-haired young man's cheeks twitched as he thought about this perfect match. On the other side, the reddish-brown-haired girl had already started thanking Paitila profusely. All right, that's all I'm in charge of. The rest is up to you guys. Dear, has Lord Paitila left? Then, shall we begin? The effects and whatnot, we must give it a try. Indeed, we should give it a try. 7 to 8 hours had passed since the conversation with Paitila. In order to test the Mother Earth's blessing, the black-haired young man and reddish-brown-haired girl began their union without even eating dinner. Perhaps because of the hope of conceiving a child, Xia Luo acted out of character this time and persisted for a long time. Reaching out to touch the teeth marks on his shoulder, the black-haired young man couldn't help but think of the elf lady's adorable appearance when her body trembled but persisted in being intimate with him. Under the young lady's efforts, Luoya succeeded as Paitila said and drew 10 times in a row. Looking at the young lady behind him who was sleeping soundly on the bed and sweating profusely, Luoya's eyes couldn't help but flash with pity. He sighed inwardly that he was too reckless this time. Even if it was for the child, he couldn't be so reckless next time. After all, compared to the fruit of love that he hadn't even seen, Luoya loved Xia Luo more. As the gemstone necklace fleet moved forward, Luoya and the others were getting closer and closer to Luochet. As the young man and girl returned to the civilized world, they had to consider some things, such as where to go next. Although Luoya didn't go to the front line, the influence he caused seemed to be much stronger than fighting the mutants on the front line. Just his existence alone attracted many monsters and cultists. The effect of this was even greater than the effect of thousands of troops. This time, Xia Luo's change. If he didn't discover some clues in the academy, the young lady would have died in the hands of the 6 disasters. This wasn't the first time such a situation happened to the young lady beside Luoya, and it was likely not the last time. Before dealing with the cultists and the 6 disasters, I shouldn't go to the front line. First, it was the memories of the ancient Gulandair, and then it was Paitila's unique blessing for the young lady. One after another, Luoya was a little overwhelmed. After recalling today's experience, Luoya naturally thought of the remaining one of the 3 ancient gods. Thinking of the white-haired, red-eyed witch queen, the black-haired young man couldn't help but mutter to himself. Ever since he got together with Xia Luo, Luoya, who took care of the young lady every day, rarely communicated with the ancient gods. This battle was originally an opportunity, but because of the special nature of the Lord of the Dead Tide, Luoya didn't dare to let Paitila and Altacia fight, so the two sides didn't meet. Now that Luoya's body had recovered a lot, there was no situation where the connection couldn't be connected. So the reason why the channel was disconnected seemed to be the Witch Queen herself. But why did Altacia do this? Perhaps she was angry because she didn't look for her for so long? Gazing at the moon in the sky, the black-haired young man drank alone under the moonlight. Thousands of miles away in Akhat territory, under the same moonlight, the silver-haired young lady was reading the letter in Luoya's room. Annihilating the 6 disasters was no doubt a matter that could greatly inspire people and should be publicized on a large scale. Reading such a letter, the silver-haired young lady couldn't hide her excitement. But unlike the others, the young lady's excitement didn't come from the honor that belonged to the Akhat family, but also from another reason. Saying so, the young lady stood up, looked at the maid beside her, and ordered without hesitation, "Let's go. Let's go to Rose." Chapter 511. The physique of Transcended was very strong. This was the common understanding of Shiya's human beings. This understanding was not only in combat, but also in daily life. The difference between bloodlines could be said to be unimaginable. For example, in terms of physical strengthening, Gelt with the giant bloodline completely beat everyone. Wilhelmina with the dragon bloodline also had a strong body that was difficult for outsiders to match. But on the other hand, Stuart and Xia Luo were more pitiful. It was just a pity that the elf lady could use this convenient curse vessel to fight outside. But in the battlefield of love in the room, she could only abandon her armor and be utterly defeated. Although it was said to be a meal together, the posture of the two was not very formal, sitting opposite each other this time. Instead, it seemed to return to the time when the girl was seriously ill more than half a month ago. Xia Luo leaned on the boy's chest, and Luoya carefully fed her. In such a situation, the two naturally didn't want to play before returning to Rosetta. In fact, they were forced by the situation. As for the specific reason, it was Xia Luo couldn't stand up by herself. When she got up this morning, the brown-haired girl couldn't get up, as if she didn't have enough sleep because of last night's messing around. After barely getting up, she covered her abdomen with her hand and looked shy. 1 second. Remember, the elf lady, who had experienced a night of fierce battle, expressed such feelings with a flushed face. Luoya, who saw this seductive scene, couldn't help but widen his eyes. His heartbeat accelerated for a long time, and it was difficult to calm down. As a last resort, Luoya could only resume his old job. After half a month, he began to nurse her full-time again. After the two took a bath together, Luoya, who found that the situation didn't improve, simply carried Xia Luo to the restaurant. The girl was completely embarrassed because of this. Looking at the shy girl in his arms who couldn't raise her head, Luoya didn't know whether to laugh or cry for a while. He couldn't help but persuade her. I was testing Lord Petra's blessing, that's why. I'm serious. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been so insistent last night. Indeed, based on Xia Luo's behavior, she didn't have a lot of desires. Every time, it was a natural union when love was strong, or she took the initiative to seek love because she wanted a child. It wasn't the pursuit of happiness. The Highland Elves, due to their long lifespan, did not need to reproduce in large numbers. It seemed that they were rather pure and had few desires. It was difficult for them to conceive in the first place, and they did not actively reproduce. It was no wonder that their race was gradually declining. Thinking of this, the young man changed his tone and gently coaxed the young lady to eat. Seeing such a girl, Luoya's heart was finally relieved. After letting go of her worries, the reddish-brown-haired girl's mood improved a lot. The two of them began to shift their attention, caring for each other with all their might like in the past. Only when the maids entered the room with smiles on their faces did the two of them restrain themselves. Master Luoya, this is the information from the front line and some documents that must be approved. After more than half a month of battle with the Lord of the Dead Tide, both Luoya and Xia Luo's bodies had recovered greatly. Under the full treatment of the Rossetti Medical Group, the daily life of the two was no longer a problem. It was precisely because of this that the heavy burden of work once again pressed on their shoulders. Although the sudden work interrupted the sweet atmosphere of the two, neither Luoya nor Xia Luo complained about it. Instead, they treated these documents very seriously. The reason was very simple. The two had not been in contact with the outside world for too long. In this way, the two of them spent more than a month in their own world as if they were on their honeymoon. Now that they were about to return to Rossetti, it was time to understand the world's situation. First of all, Luoya was most concerned about the Eastern Defense Line, which was related to the fate of the entire human race. After the Tuk Fortress incident, Kadia had been appointed as the deputy commander of the Eastern Defense Line. The black-haired young man had always been very sensitive to relevant information, and this time was no exception. The frequency and intensity of the conflict had decreased. This naturally wasn't because of the mutants' love for peace, but because of the weather. When it was comfortable to fight, it was completely up to the flow, and it was obvious that winter wasn't very comfortable. In winter, the conflict between the two sides would decrease. This kind of situation happened almost every year in history. After confirming that there were no major incidents in the Eastern Defense Line, Luoya saw another report about the Saint Heroes Society in Rossetti. The performance of the support troops led by Master Andrew this time was somewhat unsatisfactory. Due to the distance, they couldn't catch up with the battle between Luoya and the Lord of the Dead Tide. In order to make up for this mistake, Andrew and the others used all their forces to hunt down the cultists, and they finally had some results recently. The Saint Heroes Society had been struggling at death's door for many years. It would be best if they could take this opportunity to get rid of it. If not, it would be a good thing to deal a heavy blow to them. With this thought in mind, Luoya smiled and nodded. He felt that this was one of the best reports he had seen in recent years. However, what the young man didn't expect was that this thought only lasted for a few seconds before it was broken by new news. Chapter 512. Ever since he was young, Luoya Akit had never won a battle without doing anything. There were millions of Shia cultists, and half of them had their eyes on Luoya. Although most of them were useless and could not break through the double protection of the Vatican and the Akit family, the remaining believers of the Savior and the Saint Heroes Society posed a great threat. Both Roy Akit and Vincent Akit of the Akit family were lone wolves, and they did not join forces with any other forces. It had always been the Akit family fighting alone, until there were only two of them in this generation. Luoya had no choice but to drag Heathcliff and the Serofia family into the car. Originally, Luoya thought that this time, Luoya felt that it was better than New Year's Eve news that Luo Chet's side had been enlightened. However, before he was ready to celebrate this great victory, the next piece of news was even more shocking. For a moment, Luoya was in disbelief. The source of this information was the dean of the academy, Antonio. Or rather, it was a special task force set up by the higher-ups after the attack on the Lillian Investigation Group. Their specific duty was to hunt down and annihilate the believers of the Savior in the human world. After half a year of hard work, they had a major breakthrough. To be honest, the result of this battle was a little awkward. However, for Luoya, who had seen the collector's methods, it was very realistic. Remember it in a second. Although there was no news of another battle, Luoya was very excited even though he had only confirmed the collector's location. After all, the collector could be said to be the cultist who posed the biggest threat to the Akit family. Originally, Luoya thought that Shia was the only cultists, but it turned out that Shia was the only cultists. This sudden surprise surprised Luoya. However, after being happy for a while, the black-haired young man picked up his cautiousness and began to think about possible accidents. Unlike the passionate gaze she gave to Luoya, the Mother Goddess was generally too lazy to respond to the prayers of the Saint Heroes Guild. She did not even look at them, and the cultists could do nothing about it, so they could only turn their attention to the 6 calamities. This time, it was Loche's elite team that went to attack them. As a team that used Gem Curse as their main means of attack, there was no doubt that they had some restraining effect on the Saint Heroes Guild. It seemed that there was no need to worry too much, unless there was one possibility, which was that the Saint Heroes Guild would release the 6 disasters, S.E.Egg, and die together with them. The recent 6 calamities were different from other historical periods. They had all been activated. Even the seal of Luoya's ancestor, Kaldos, could not trap the Lord of the Dead Tide. It was hard for the young man to imagine that Shangjia had a method that could surpass Kaldos. On the other hand, they probably did not dare to do so. It was obvious that it was almost impossible. After confirming this, Luoya focused all his attention on the collector. Priest's example could be said to be the most typical example, and it was because of this that Luoya had always been unable to judge the strength of the Savior's believers. After all, they were likely to be lurking in the crowd. However, one thing was for sure. Some of the old monsters that existed since the Second Era were astonishingly powerful, and they might have some special means. Luoya's expression was uncertain. If this incident was a trap, then it would be a trap targeting Dean Antonio, who was also an ally that Luoya could not afford to lose. Among the current source rank 1, Old Man John had always been in the Holy Capital to stabilize the people. The Austin Empire's Emperor Lucas was completely unreliable. The Night Country's king was on the front lines with Wilhelmina. There was also Leighton, who was in a semi-retired state, but was the only person in the Austin Empire who could balance the emperor. After pondering for a long time, Luoya was still hesitant. It was only after Golasi helped Xiaoluot and asked for Luoya's request that the black-haired young man calmed down. Letter paper? The young man nodded and made the final decision to protect his own people. No matter if it was the convenience that the academy provided for Luoya or the fact that he helped Luoya hide the fact that he was following Lillian. It was all due to Dean Antonio's concern for his junior. Now that the white-haired old man might fall into a trap, how could Luoya allow Antonio to take the risk for his own safety? All in all, it was to provide as much information as possible and leave the rest to Antonio. This was probably the only thing that Luoya could do. Honorable Dean of Antonio Academy, due to Rose's geographical location being closer to the south, winter wasn't too cold and snowfall was relatively rare. The light snow that started this morning didn't last long and stopped at noon. After the light snow, the weather cleared up quickly. The afternoon sun shone on one's body, and even though it wasn't warm, it made one feel carefree. It wasn't because the servant girl wasn't attentive enough, but because there were only Luoya and Xia Luo left in the study room. Since one of them was done, there was no need for Gulacy to guard the room. Luoya automatically became Xia Luo's assistant, and the brown-haired young lady didn't have any objections. This time, the urgent documents sent from the front line were the approval of the transportation of supplies, which was also the main responsibility of the Rose Commercial United Nations as the money bag and logistics department. Normally speaking, according to the front line's requests, they would give them whatever they wanted. After all, no matter how poor they were, they couldn't afford to impoverish the frontline soldiers. But recently, it was different. The supply requests of the various troops were habitually labeled as urgent. Luoya, who came from a military family, wasn't surprised at all. After all, to the generals on the front line, their own soldiers were the most important, and no one wanted to receive supplies slower than others. Regarding this, Luoya could only say that the soldiers weren't as scheming as this group of businessmen. But this was also a good thing. As the saying went, good steel should be used on the blade. Although Rose was rich, it didn't grow on trees. It had been half a year since Lillian went to the front line. In this time, Luoya almost didn't hear any news about her, so after seeing this application, he immediately read it in detail. After all, everyone knew about the relationship between Rose and the Austin Empire. Besides, Xia Luo and Lillian had always been hostile toward each other. He didn't expect that when it came to fighting together, Xia Luo would give Lillian the highest priority. Withdrawing his admiring gaze from the young lady, the black-haired young man refocused his attention on the documents. As he read, Luoya couldn't help but feel longing and concern, as well as urgent questions. Senior sister, is she okay? Chapter 5:13. Roja Arquette was worried about Lillian Archerman's situation. This could be said to be a normal thing. Whether it was for the Fallen or the Saint Heroes Guild, Lillian was an unexpected situation and someone who must be dealt with. Once something happened to Luoya, the cultist's next target would be Lillian. Because of her soft-heartedness toward Luoya, Lillian aroused the suspicion of the Austin Empire's emperor, Lucas. She wasn't even able to attend the international conference and was sent to the front lines directly. As for the Shia countries, the Austin Empire wasn't a good partner either. In this case, one could see how bad the Austin Empire's relations were. Moreover, Lillian had a debuff similar to being banished, so it was normal for her situation to be bad. Whether it was the ancient Austin Empire's army or the 10 cities, they could be said to be the ultimate killing weapon in large-scale battles. They had the ability to easily change the direction of the battlefield. In terms of level, Lillian was already at Origin Stage 2. With this thought in mind, the young man read the investigation report attached by the Sorofia family. According to the investigator's description, the fortress Lillian was in was one of the gateways to the Austin Empire. There were indeed several fierce battles in the past 6 months, but as Luoya expected, due to Lillian's presence, the battles ended in great victories. In the report, the investigator was a little puzzled, but because Lillian was indeed at the front lines and had won many great victories, she was given the highest recommendation. A small counterattack in winter wasn't the first time this kind of military operation was carried out. Instead, it was a common practice in all the mutants' wars. Generally speaking, it was a low-risk, high-yield affair, and also a good opportunity to take the initiative to make contributions. But it was such a good opportunity that Lillian let it go just like that, which made Luoya a little confused. With this thought in mind, the The young man frowned and read the document repeatedly. However, he didn't have the slightest clue, so he could only give up for the time being. Putting down the document in his hand, the black-haired young man turned to look at the clear sky outside the window. For a moment, his heart was in turmoil. However, what the young man didn't know was that at the distant border, a black-haired, purple-eyed young lady was also making a difficult choice. The Austin Empire's Fort Noyce had always been called a meat grinder by the border soldiers. This was because of the geographical factors that made it so. In history, this fortress had been breached several times. Every time, corpses would pile up like mountains and blood would flow like rivers. This was where the name meat grinder came from. Every time there was a war with the mutants, the soldiers in charge of guarding this place would be the most nervous and depressed. One person, half a year. Be it in terms of numbers or time, it could be considered a small variable. But what no one expected was that the arrival of the new commander, Princess Lillian, completely changed everything. If the merchants were willing to sell their lives for 3 times the profit, then a victory with less than 1/10 of the casualties was enough to drive the soldiers of Noyce Fortress crazy. Lillian's performance had indeed won the hearts of all the soldiers. On the city walls, the morale of the soldiers was high, and they patrolled energetically in silence. It was a stark contrast from their depressed and nervous appearance in the past. After several major battles, the soldiers of the fortress were united and conscientious. Their goal was to reduce the burden of the commander, Her Highness the Princess. At the highest point of the fortress, in an exquisitely decorated and classical room, the black-haired young lady sat on the seat and gazed at the food on the table in silence. No one knew what she was thinking about with her purple pupils. On the other side of the table, the head maid, Audrey, gazed nervously at Her Highness the Princess, waiting for her to take action. Audrey clenched her fists slightly. After a long while, the black-haired, purple-eyed young lady finally moved. She picked up the cutlery in front of her. Chapter 514. In a classically decorated room, the black-haired, purple-eyed young lady finally finished off the food in front of her after a tough battle. After completing the most important mission, she began to pay attention to the matters she was most concerned about. The new tack fortress in the theocracy had gradually taken shape over the past year. The commander was Nuwa Iyer, Heathcliff, and the deputy commander was Marquis Akkad, Kadia Akkad. In order to stabilize the nation's emotions, Nuwa Iyer, as the princess, had to take the lead and lead the troops into battle. Kadia became the assistant. Regarding this, neither the military nor the civilians had any objections. This also showed the church's stance on the front lines of the Holy War. If Kadia were to return to the country, he would definitely visit the Akkad family. After all, the human alliance would launch a major attack in the coming spring. This would be his last chance to return home. And now that it was the holidays, it meant that Kadia would definitely see Luoya. Your Highness, I've confirmed that Marquis Akkad will be returning to the theocracy of Saint Maester to report on his work and will set off in a few days. Half a year ago, the brown-haired maid knew nothing about the man who had impregnated Her Highness out of wedlock. But after spending half a year with Lillian, Audrey couldn't help but notice some clues. Among them, the son of Marquis Akkad of the Saint Maester theocracy, Roha Akkad, was the most suspicious. Audrey was having a headache over this situation. If the father of the child in Lillian's stomach was a noble of the Austin Empire, it would be slightly beneficial for the young lady. But if the father was a noble of the Saint Maester theocracy, the support of the people for Lillian would plummet. With this thought in mind, the maid lowered her head and waited for Lillian's orders. On the other side, the black-haired, purple-eyed young lady revealed a conflicted expression. After arriving at the border, Luoya had completely lost contact with Lillian. The only thing he could think of was to write a letter to the academy or the Akkad family. But this action was undoubtedly suicidal for the young lady who was still under suspicion. One of them was naturally the ace agent who had been helping Luoya and Lillian, Paul Ackman. As the illegitimate son of the Austin Empire, Paul had the possibility of going to the front lines to meet Lillian and returning to the academy to meet Luoya. Moreover, his reasons were sufficient, and there was almost no risk of him being targeted. The two useless good-for-nothings were afraid that the illegitimate son would go to the front lines and establish a career to push back into the country. Lillian was well aware of this, but it was also because of this that the chances of getting in touch with Paul became slim. The Akot family had very few members. Even after 2 generations, there were only 2 of them. They were already on the verge of collapse. During this period of time, Luoya had been assassinated by the Fallen more than once. Under such circumstances, the family didn't have a 3rd generation yet. Kadia was probably extremely anxious. That was why, even if Lillian was pregnant with an illegitimate child, she wasn't afraid to tell the head of the Akot family. The young lady wasn't worried that Kadia wouldn't believe her. If Kadia knew that Lillian was pregnant with Luoya's child, he would definitely find a way to inform the young man no matter what. He might even provide protection for Lillian at a critical moment. But the problem was that Lillian's contact with Kadia was still very dangerous, even if it was a formal military exchange. Audrey, when will the 3rd batch of reinforcements from the Scholar Country arrive? Half a year. Huh? Lillian remembered that when she was with Luoya, the young man did mention that teacher Chris used to be the junior of Luoya's father, Kadia. She had been in love with Kadia all these years. Previously, she even paid a visit to the Akot family in order to meet Kadia. Unlike other classrooms with hundreds of students, Chris's classroom only had Lillian at the front lines. She was also Chris's favorite student. In such a situation, the beautiful red-haired teacher would definitely come to check on the situation. This would be the best opportunity for Lillian. After thinking about all this, the young lady stroked her stomach. Her expression gradually softened. Chapter 5:15. In the quiet room, the black-haired young man held the letter in his hand for a moment. After a slight hesitation, he slowly opened it. The entire contents of the battle report were written by Master Andrew himself. It was divided into 2 parts, and Luoya could not help but be stunned when he opened it. After a closer look, one of the parts was actually packaged separately, and on the cover, there was a sentence written, "To be opened by Luoya Akot or Xialuot Serofia." When he saw this sentence, the black-haired young man's golden pupil shrank, and he suddenly had a bad feeling. After hesitating for a moment, Luoya chose to read the battle report without any special conditions. After many days of investigation and tracking, and with the help of the Serofia Chamber of Commerce, Lo She's elite finally locked the nest of the Saint Heroes Society in the southern valley of the Principality of Torneo. Lo She's side was determined to succeed in this operation, so they did not care about the cost. After discovering that they might be discovered by the barrier of the valley, Lo She's side decisively stopped moving forward and decided to use a large amount of precious metals and gems as the price to carry out a carpet bombing of the enemy's nest. In this battle, Lo She's side was very determined and decisive. More than half of the cultists were killed or injured by the bombing and were quickly annihilated. The cultists who wanted to break out of the encirclement crashed into the arms of Lo She's troops and suffered a head-on blow. In this battle, Lo She's elite troops killed a total of 2 source rank, 2 experts, 2 escaped, and as many as 10 source rank, 3 cultists were killed or injured. In terms of high-end combat power, the Saint Heroes Society was not much worse than Lo She's side. If it were not for the chaos caused by the curse at the beginning of the battle, the outcome of the battle might have been uncertain. At the end of the report, it said that Lo She's side was cleaning up the scene, trying to find something valuable, and officially issued a wanted order to the entire Shia for the 2 escaped source rank, 2 cultists. For the Saint Heroes Assembly, Luoya could only passively wait for their people to come to their deaths. However, he never expected that this time, it would be his side that won. From Luoya's point of view, the biggest reason why the Rose elites were able to win was because of the first wave of bombardment. The casualties were secondary, but the main reason was to destroy the enemy's morale. In fact, the Saint Heroes Association did not organize a large-scale counterattack in the subsequent battles. The black-haired youth was very satisfied with the contents of the battle report. However, when he looked at the secret letter sent to Luo Ye and Xia Luot, his expression became somewhat doubtful. Suppressing his excitement, the black-haired young man picked up the second letter, opened it, and carefully read it. However, as he read, the black-haired young man's face gradually turned ugly, and his temperament also changed. According to the logic of ordinary people, although Luo Ye's crown source substance had a strong restraining effect on the 6 disasters, it was only so. It did not harm the Saint Heroes Association itself. Luo Ye's ability did not have any restraining effect on these people who believed in the Mother Goddess, and if it was to defend the dignity of the Mother Goddess, it seemed that something was wrong. After all, the 6 disasters were only oracles, the creations of the Mother Goddess. Having a restraining effect on them was not the same concept as having a restraining effect on the Mother Goddess. If Luo Ye saw the egg of the 6 disasters, it would only absorb the crown stone and destroy it, but if the Saint Heroes Association saw it, it would be sealed and used as a secret weapon. In comparison, Luo Ye was better. The second letter could only be opened by Luo Ye and Xia Luot. In fact, the content was a continuation of the first battle report, which was the discovery of the Rose elites in the valley. In fact, after the battle, the Rose side captured a lot of injured cultists and found that there were not only buildings on the ground in the valley, but also underground. Chapter 5:16. The human body often has different characteristics under different emotions. For example, when one is happy, one will naturally relax one's muscles. When one is sad, one will easily feel cold all over. These are all subconscious actions, and also an instinct that is difficult for humans to control. When she was asleep, Xia Luot felt a curse power fluctuation that belonged to Luo Ye that she had never seen before. It was a curse power fluctuation that contained great anger and sadness, but also mixed with some indignation and sadness, like a sigh. When Xia Luot felt and understood the curse power fluctuation, she opened her eyes and looked at the young man above her. And as she expected, Luo Ye's expression was quite depressed, or rather, tired. If he found out that Xia Luot woke up, the young man who never liked to make people worry would definitely put on a smiling face. The girl was sure of this, but it was also because of this that Xia Luot was worried and puzzled. Thinking about this, Xia Luot hesitated for a moment and greeted the young man. You're awake? How did you wake up so fast? It hasn't even been an hour. How about you sleep for a while more? You still have work in the afternoon. Looking at Luo Ye, who forced a smile and cared about Xia Luot and wanted the girl to continue her afternoon nap, the red-haired girl fell into silence. After a while, she said calmly, Xia Luot? After staring at the surprised Luo Ye for a long time, the girl raised her hand, stroked the young man's cheek, and asked softly again. This is, a large amount of blood and even body organs of their ancestors were found in the cultists' facility. This was unbearable for anyone and was also a great insult to their family. When such a situation happened to Luo Ye, not to mention himself, even Xia Luot felt very uncomfortable. After repeatedly lowering her head and raising her head to speak several times, the reddish-brown-haired girl gave up on using words and simply straddled the Luo Ye. She straightened her body and hugged Luo Ye tightly in her arms. Stroking the youth's hair, Xia Luot was silent for a moment before softly speaking. Crying? I really can't do that. After all, although he is my ancestor, I don't know him. Rather than saying that I'm upset, it's better to say that I feel bad for them. Was it not worth it? Indeed. Since the beginning of the Second Era, the Royal Selector clan had been guarding the peace of the human world. Although they had also obtained a high status, there had never been a lack of blood and sacrifices. They had always been hidden in the darkness and not known by people. And above the blood of the Royal Selector clan, there was peace and prosperity and the rise of human civilization. Now, 1,000 years later, the once powerful clan had disappeared without a trace. Their honor had also disappeared along with the fall of the empire. The entire clan had declined to the point where there were only 2 generations left. In fact, before Luo Ye awakened his bloodline, in the eyes of the other clans, the Akot clan was almost finished. The Saint Heroes Association obtained power from their flesh and blood. The powerful extraordinaries couldn't resist the temptation and slashed at them after they fell. As an ally, the Akman clan betrayed them. But now, 1,000 years later, only the Royal Selector clan was lingering on the edge of decline. Xiaoluot, do you think good people will really have good karma? Facing Luo Ye's question, Xiaoluot couldn't give an answer for the time being. No matter what kind of language was used to describe it, it was a fact that good people might not have good karma. The Guardian's tragic end was an undeniable truth written in the history of the Akot clan for 1,000 years. I don't dare to say that good people will definitely have good karma, but I think that evil people who keep doing evil will definitely receive retribution. That's right. Those sinners who have committed heinous crimes will definitely be punished. If not, then let me. Listening to the words of the red-haired girl, the black-haired boy widened his eyes in surprise. He then raised his head and looked at Xiaoluot in front of him. He found that the elf lady was looking at him firmly. The belief in her eyes was firm and unshakable. Dear, leave the matter of the Saint Heroes Association to us. You don't have to care about it anymore, okay? You want me to leave it alone? But this is the matter of the Akot clan. Leaving it to Lo Shay is a bit. Hearing Luo Ye's answer, the red-haired girl showed some dissatisfaction on her face. Luo Ye saw this and hurriedly explained. We're not married, so? Although we're not married, I'm your fiancé, right? At this special time, as a fiancé, is it strange to do something for my fiancé? Looking at the dissatisfied girl, Luo Ye was speechless for a while. Xiaoluot saw this and sighed. Location, you mean, for a long time, the policy of the Lo Shay Commercial United Nations has been to hide their strength and bide their time. In the 100 years of the founding of the country, with this way of doing things, the Sorofia family had indeed expanded their business to the ends of the world. But in recent years, the tide of peace has gradually receded, and Lo Shay must seek change. Hearing this, Luo Ye thought for a moment and nodded slightly. He agreed with Xiaoluot's idea. After all, compared with the theocracy and the Austin Empire, Lo Shay's influence and right to speak were indeed much worse. If this was the case, then the Saint Heroes Association could indeed be handed over to Lo Shay. It would be bad for the Akot clan to intervene. Huh, what did you forget? Grabbing Luo Ye's cheek, the red-haired girl pouted and said so in a huff. Luo Ye couldn't help but widen his eyes slightly. Well, you're right, but it's not just the Saint Heroes Association. There's also the group of fallen. The problem that Luo Ye was sad about belonged to the past. It was something that Xiaoluot couldn't touch in any way. It belonged to the sad part of the Akot clan. In that field, the girl was powerless no matter how much she said, but it was different when it came to children. Looking at the boy whose sadness had mostly dissipated, the red-haired girl's face showed a little smile. She began to think about how to sweep away the last haze in Luo Ye's heart, then suddenly thought of a problem. I probably have to discuss the specific plan with father, but I want to transport it back to the Akot territory first. Hearing Luo Ye's plan, Xiaoluot made such a proposal. The black-haired boy blinked and also thought about it. After all, the situation that Xiaoluot said was likely to exist, and the possibility was not small. Of course, it didn't rule out the possibility that there were still blood samples in other facilities of the Saint Heroes Association, but Luo Ye couldn't do anything about it. Looking at the location of the Saint Heroes Association's facilities and the escorts, it was inevitable that they would pass by Rose on the way to Akate territory. And since they passed by, as Roja's fiancé, how could she not do something? Dear, in that case, how about we worship the ancestors together? Here in Rose, if the family members who died in the battlefield return, they will hold some ceremonies to pray for blessings. Akot territory has similar customs, right? Then it's settled. Let's hold a ceremony for the ancestors in Rose, by you and as your wife. Reaching out her hand to cover the boy's mouth, the girl said so with a blush on her cheeks, revealing a happy smile. Chapter 5:17. Rose's ancestral sacrifice wasn't an ordinary ritual. Instead, it was a rather grand and solemn event. Perhaps it could be said that it was exceptionally important to the family and had a strong family nature. On this day, the family members had to personally welcome the deceased outside the city and bring the remains to the shrine dedicated to the primordial goddess Shia. After a grand blessing ceremony, the deceased would be allowed to rest in peace. Then, the closest family member would send the remains to the burial ground and lay them to rest. As a matter of fact, not only Rose, but the nobles of nearby countries would also come here every year in hopes of praying for the blessings of their ancestors at Shia's shrine. However, the owners of the shrine, the Serofia family, rarely participated in the ceremony, let alone the owner of the shrine, Xiaoluot. It was apparent that as the descendant of the king's selection bloodline, Luoya had to participate in the ceremony. However, it was too difficult for one person to complete the ceremony. At least 2 people were needed. And this was exactly what the red-haired young lady wanted. Although Luoya and Xiaoluo didn't need such a compulsory guarantee, it was different in the eyes of others. Or perhaps, the young lady wanted others to recognize her identity, such as Luoya's father. Remember in a second. Xiaoluo was excited at this thought. Her emerald pupils were filled with determination. Upon seeing this young lady, Luoya revealed a helpless smile. Among all the young ladies Luoya knew, Xiaoluo was the one who lacked a sense of security the most. Not only was it because of the loyalty source substance of the Serofia family, but more importantly, it was due to the pressure from Luoya's father, Kadia. Originally, Xiaoluo wanted to get pregnant before Kadia returned to the Akot family in order to change Kadia's attitude toward her. But after trying for a long time, Xiaoluo realized that her constitution might not be able to achieve this goal. As a result, she changed her direction and chose to worship the ancestors to further strengthen their relationship. My dear, you really agreed? After nodding and agreeing to Xiaoluo's request, the reddish-brown-haired girl's mood became increasingly warm. The young man and the girl hugged each other for a long time, and their hearts were once again drawn together by the attraction of the rings. After making a series of plans to worship the ancestors, Luoya and Xiaoluo continued their journey. The following days were indeed quite leisurely. It had to be said that with the progress of human society, the custom of praying for the dead ancestors in Shia continued to decline. Rose, due to its unique geography and history, was the best-preserved country, far surpassing other countries. Naturally, Luoya could not say such a ridiculous idea out loud. However, Luoya still had a positive attitude towards this custom. Chapter 5:18. Ai Lizzie Akate, in Rose, was the name of the adopted daughter of Marquis Akate, who was in charge of the neighboring territory. In St. Freya Academy, this was the name of the new preceptor of the first year. Xiaoluo and Ai Lizzie had always been enemies since they met. This was an undeniable fact, but unlike others, Xiaoluo had an absolute advantage over Ai Lizzie in the past, and that was the marriage contract. However, after Luoya and the red-haired girl entered history, following a series of events such as Luoya's injury and Nua Ayer's counterattack, the marriage contract between the two was no longer enforceable, and Ai Lizzie gradually recovered some of her decline. The red-haired girl could confidently say that as long as it wasn't a specific matter, Ai Lizzie wouldn't pose a threat to her, but unfortunately, things didn't go as she wished. Was the news leaked? No, that's impossible. It was clearly decided a few days ago, and my dear didn't write a letter. Also, Rose didn't send a report about Ai Lizzie's arrival, which means it was a coincidence? Ai Lizzie, why is she here? No, after I was injured, I was afraid that Ai Lizzie would be worried, so I didn't write a letter to my family. Hearing Luoya's words, the red-haired girl fell into silence and looked forward with a conflicted expression. As the convoy gradually approached, the reunion between the two sides officially began. Overall, the performance of the parties in front of the city gate was considered calm. First, It was the meeting between the reddish-brown-haired young mistress and Bruce. This part was rather touching. Seeing that his daughter was fine, Bruce's eyes welled up with tears, which was rare for him. Charlot was also affected by her father's tears. Before this, the black-haired boy had also met Bruce a few times. In his impression, Bruce had always been the representative of calm and steady, with a bit of Kadia, a veteran noble who didn't show his emotions on his face. And on the other hand, during the period when Xia Luo was sick, Bruce seemed to be deeply tormented because, strictly speaking, Bruce was the first to come into contact with the curse of the Lord of the Dead Tide, and Xia Luo was implicated. Luoya, as a father, I sincerely thank you for bringing my daughter back. Facing Bruce's praise, the black-haired boy smiled and gave such a reply. Bruce's eyes widened slightly, and then he couldn't help but take another look at the girl beside him. Xia Luo's face also blushed slightly. Although Bruce had never tasted the fragrance of free love in his life, his intuition as a father still made him aware of the changes between the two of them. As for his attitude toward this, for the time being, putting aside the strength that Luoya had displayed and the achievements that she might achieve in the future, Bruce also hoped that Luoya would fulfill the engagement because after a few years of observation, Bruce had discovered that Xia Luo might only have Luoya in her heart in this lifetime. Kadia wanted the next generation of the family, and Bruce, who was also a middle-aged man, wasn't far behind. Xia Luo was the only one with the atavistic bloodline, and her children would also be the focus of the entire family. But fortunately, the two middle-aged men couldn't say anything in public. After listening to the gratitude, the black-haired boy also began the process on his side. You're tuning in to the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.